Welcome to Luke's Stories, where camping isn't all about campfires and stars, but also nightmares in the dark. I'm Calder Thornfield, and in 2017 I was working up in Bee National Park as a search and rescue officer. It's funny how people think my job is all adrenaline and heroics, but most days it's just me, the trees, and a stubborn boot that won't stay tied. It was late October, and the first hints of winter were creeping in. The air was crisp, and the tourists had mostly cleared out, leaving the park to the die-hard hikers and US Rangers. I was looking forward to a quiet shift, maybe even catching up on some podcasts if the radio reception allowed. Around midday, I got a call about a missing group of college students. 4 of them ventured out on a day hike near Lake Monona and hadn't returned. Their names were Lila, Marcus, Benji, and Priya. Just kids looking for an adventure before the semester ramped up. I radioed my partner, Owen MacLeod, a grizzled Scotsman with a beard that could house a family of birds. "Looks like we're playing babysitter again," I told him. He chuckled. And here I thought I'd get to enjoy my tea in peace. "Meet you at the trailhead in 20. We met up and started down the path they were supposed to have taken. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows that made the forest feel more imposing than usual. "You ever think about installing a GPS in every visitor?" I joked. Owen smirked. "Sure, but then what would we do for entertainment?" About an hour in, we found a discarded backpack. It was torn, one strap hanging on by a thread. "This doesn't look good," I muttered. Owen examined it. "No air marks. Looks like it was ripped by something else." "Maybe they had a run-in with a particularly aggressive shrub," I offered. He raised an eyebrow. Always the comedian. We pressed on, following what looked like a makeshift trail veering off the main path, broken branches, scuffed dirt. It was clear they went this way. The trees grew denser, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted. Then we found the first body. Benji was lying face down, his clothes shredded and, well, I'd spare you the details, but it was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Owen cursed under his breath. What in God's name could have done this? I swallowed hard. No animal I've ever seen. We heard a faint cry for help ahead. Ignoring every protocol about waiting for backup, we sprinted toward the sound. We burst into a small clearing to find Lila and Priya huddled together, eyes wide with terror. "They took Marcus," Lila screamed. "Who took him?" I asked, kneeling beside them. Before they could answer, a rustling came from the trees. We turned to see a figure emerging, a creature unlike anything I'd ever imagined. It stood on 2 legs like a human but was covered in thick, matted fur. Its limbs were elongated, ending in claws that looked sharp enough to split a hair. The face resembled a wolf's, but distorted, with a jaw that seemed unhinged. "Well, that's something you don't see every day," I whispered to Owen. He tightened his grip on his rifle. "Get the girls out of here." I didn't argue. "Come on, we need to move," I urged them. We started backing away slowly. The creature watched us with eyes that felt almost intelligent. It tilted its head as if deciding what to do with us, then it charged. Owen fired a shot, hitting it square in the chest. It staggered, but didn't go down. "Run!" he yelled. We bolted. Behind us, I heard Owen fire 2 more shots before a chilling silence fell. I wanted to go back, but I had to get the girls to safety. "Keep moving," I shouted. We stumbled through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. Priya was sobbing, and Lila was muttering under her breath, something about a curse. We broke through the tree line and reached an old ranger station, no longer in use. I ushered them inside and locked the door. "Stay here," I said. "I'll radio for help." "Don't leave us," Priya pleaded. "I won't be far, just need to get to higher ground for the radio to work." That was a lie. The radio was dead, a victim of our tumble through the forest, but I couldn't let them panic. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The sun was almost gone now, and the temperature was dropping, perfect conditions for hypothermia. Not that we needed more problems. Then I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing. The creature, blood-stained, its fur matted with Owen's blood. "Great, just great," I muttered. "Why couldn't I have taken that desk job?" I grabbed a flare from my pack and lit it, hoping to scare it off. The red glow illuminated the creature, casting eerie shadows across its twisted form. It let out a sound, a low, resonant snarl that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "Come on, big guy, you want a piece of me?" I shouted, waving the flare. It began to circle me, moving with a predatory grace. I realized then that this wasn't some mindless beast. It was calculating, intelligent. I had to think fast. "Why did the Scarecrow win an award?" I called out, my voice tinged with manic desperation. The creature paused, as if confused. "Because he was outstanding in his field." I laughed. Maybe it was the absurdity of telling a joke at a time like this, but it gave me the split second I needed. I threw the flare directly at its face. It recoiled, giving me enough time to dash back into the station. "What's happening?" Lila asked, eyes wide. "Just making new friends," I said, barricading the door with an old bookshelf. "Is Owen?" Priya began. I shook my head. "We need to focus on getting out of here." The creature slammed against the door, the wood cracking but holding for now. "There's a cellar," Lila said. "Maybe it leads outside." "Better than waiting up here," I agreed. We found the hatch and climbed down. The cellar was damp and smelled of mildew. Searching with my flashlight, I spotted a tunnel at the back. "Looks like this might connect to the old mining shafts," I said. We crawled through the tight, claustrophobic walls, the sounds of the creature tearing through the station echoing behind us. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into an open cavern. A faint breeze indicated an exit nearby. "Almost there," I encouraged them. Then a scream pierced the darkness. Marcus's voice. "He's alive!" Priya exclaimed. Against all better judgment, we followed the sound. We found Marcus lying on the ground, his leg mangled but alive. "Help me," he groaned. As we moved toward him, the creature appeared between us, blocking our path. "Why does this feel like a bad rerun?" I muttered. I needed a distraction. "Hey, ever wonder why the mushroom was invited to all the parties?" No response, not that I expected one. "Because he was a fungi." I hurled another flare past the creature, and it turned its head ever so slightly. Seizing the moment, I rushed forward, grabbing a loose stalactite from the ground. With all the strength I could muster, I struck the creature's injured shoulder. It let out a pained roar and swiped at me, claws grazing my arm. "Get Marcus out of here!" I yelled to the girls. They moved quickly, supporting him as they headed toward the exit. The creature focused back on me, eyes filled with cold fury. "All right, pal," I said through gritted teeth. "Let's finish this." It lunged, and I dodged to the side. The claws narrowly missed my face. I stumbled but regained my footing, spotting a crevice in the wall. "I got an idea! Come and get me!" I taunted, backing toward the gap. It charged again. At the last second I dove into the crevice. The creature slammed into the wall, rocks shaking loose from the impact. One particularly large stone dislodged from above, crashing down onto the creature's back. It let out a pained howl and collapsed. I didn't wait to see if it was down for good. I sprinted toward the exit, blood seeping from the cut on my arm. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking. The others were huddled together near the mouth of the cave. "Is it over?" Priya asked. "Let's hope so," I said, gasping for air. We made our way back to civilization, where the authorities took over. Owen's body was recovered, and the area was cordoned off. Official reports labeled it a bear attack. I didn't argue. Who would believe the truth? In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the need for answers. I visited a local indigenous elder named Now. When I described the creature, his face grew solemn. "You have encountered the Sakini," he said, "a being born from dark magic, a corrupted soul taking the form of a beast. Why would it attack us?" I asked. He looked at me with tired eyes. "The Sakini feeds on fear and despair. It is drawn to those who are lost, both physically and spiritually." "Well, that explains why I found a buffet with us," I said dryly. He didn't laugh. "Be careful, Calder. Such encounters leave a mark." I left with more questions than answers, but at least I had a name. The Sakini, a creature of legend, its origins steeped in the ancient history of the land, motivated by a hunger that defied natural law. In the end, the park resumed normal operations. Life went on, but somewhere out there the Sakini might still roam, driven by an insatiable desire to feed. After all my digging, I learned its name was Sakini, a dark spirit born of corruption, hunting those who wander too far into its realm. Red River Gorge felt like the perfect escape. A few days surrounded by nature with no emails, no deadlines, just the wild and my camera. I needed this. Chris, my oldest friend, needed it too, though he wasn't much of a camper. I convinced him to come along. I figured the trip might rekindle our bond. We parked my RV at a quiet trailhead, miles from the crowded campgrounds. As I unloaded my gear, Chris sat on a rock, fiddling with a bottle of water. "I still don't know why I agreed to this," he muttered, squinting at the dense forest. "It's like the trees are closing in." I laughed. "That's the point, Chris. We're off the grid. Fresh air, peace, maybe even some wildlife for me to photograph." "Yeah, great. Bears, wolves, that sounds peaceful." I ignored him, shouldering my pack. "Come on, it's a short hike. We'll camp near the river." Chris groaned, but followed. The trail was narrow, lined with jagged cliffs and thick underbrush. The gorge lived up to its reputation, stunning, rugged, and untamed. But there was something else too. The air felt heavy. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the humidity. By the time we reached the riverbed, the sun was low on the horizon. I paused, staring. Something was wrong. The river was gone. Where there should have been rushing water, there was only cracked, dry earth. Chris stopped beside me, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. Evan, are you sure this is the spot?" "Positive," I said, pulling out my map. "The river runs right through here." Chris crouched, touching the dry ground. "Looks like it hasn't been here in years." "That's impossible. It was flowing last week." My voice faltered. It didn't make sense. I felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly buried it. "It's probably seasonal," I lied, unwilling to admit how unsettling this was. "Let's set up camp." As night fell, the forest came alive. Or rather, it didn't. Normally the woods buzzed with life, insects, frogs, rustling leaves. But here the silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. Chris sat close to the fire, nervously poking at the flames. "Does it feel quiet to you?" "It's remote," I said, fiddling with my camera. "Relax," he snorted. "Sure, relax, while nature murders me." "Chris, you're being," I stopped. My camera had just powered down. Frowning, I turned it back on and reviewed the footage from earlier. That's when I saw it, a figure. It was blurry, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably humanoid. It stood at the edge of the frame, hidden among the trees. I blinked, rewound the clip and zoomed in. The image distorted, the figure disappearing into static. "What's wrong?" Chris asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I said quickly, shutting the camera off. "Just a glitch." The first night passed without sleep. I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps circling our campsite, stopping just outside the firelight. Every time I shone my flashlight, there was nothing. Nothing. Chris didn't hear it. He was snoring in his tent, blissfully unaware. The next morning we met Laura. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from the trees as we packed our gear. Her boots were worn, her hair tied back beneath a bandana. She looked like she belonged here, unlike Chris, who flinched at the sight of her. "Morning," she said, her tone friendly but guarded. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far out." "We're camping," I said, forcing a smile, "doing some photography." She nodded, her dark eyes scanning the dry riverbed. "Strange, isn't it? This river used to run year-round." "You've been here before?" Chris asked. "A few times," she said, "but I stay on the main trails now. This area is different." "Different how?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. "You've heard the stories, right? About the Wendigo?" Chris groaned. "Oh, great, a ghost story. That's what I need." "It's not a ghost," Laura said sharply. "It's a spirit, a creature. The Wendigo appears when something's wrong, when the land's been disrespected or people have gone too far. It preys on greed and hunger." I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Well, good thing we're not greedy." Laura didn't laugh. She looked at me, then at Chris. "Be careful. Things can change quickly out here." Laura's warning lingered as we hiked deeper into the forest. Chris was unusually quiet, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. I tried to shake off my unease, focusing on setting up new motion sensor cameras. But as I reviewed the footage, the images disturbed me. The cameras captured blurry shapes, elongated humanoid figures skirting the edges of the frame. I didn't tell Chris. He was already on edge. That night, the forest came alive with sounds, faint growls, snapping twigs, and something that sounded like breathing. I stayed by the fire, gripping my flashlight while Chris sat rigid beside me. "I heard it," he whispered. "Tell me you heard it." "I heard it," I admitted. "Stay close." At some point, Chris stood abruptly. "I'm going to the RV." "No way," I said. "It's too far," but he was already walking into the darkness. I chased after him, my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. "Chris, stop!" I turned, his face pale. "Didn't you hear her? Laura's voice. She's calling for help." I stared at him. "Chris, Laura's not here." But he wasn't listening. He kept moving faster now until I grabbed his arm and yanked him back. "Listen to me," I shouted. "You're not thinking clearly." Chris looked at me, confused, as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard." The growling returned, closer this time. The foul stench of decay filled the air, making my stomach churn. Something moved in the shadows, too fast to see. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted back to camp, but the fire had died. The woods pressed in around us, suffocating and silent. Then came the mimicry. "Chris," a voice called, identical to mine. He froze, staring into the trees. "Evan, what?" "It's not me," I hissed. "Don't listen to it." The voice came again, closer. "Chris, help me." Chris grabbed my arm, his face white with fear. "What is that?" The answer came with a snap of branches. A figure stepped into the clearing, a gaunt, elongated humanoid with glowing eyes and claws that gleamed in the faint moonlight. The smell of rot was overwhelming. It was the Wendigo. I shoved Chris toward the trail. "Run! Don't stop!" The Wendigo moved with unnatural speed, circling us. Its glowing eyes locked on Chris. It growled, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. Chris tripped, falling hard, and I turned back, swinging my flashlight wildly. The light caught the creature's face, twisted and skeletal, its lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. It flinched, momentarily blinded, and I used the distraction to drag Chris to his feet. We stumbled through the forest, the Wendigo's footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving. We found Laura at the edge of the forest. She had a torch in one hand and a look of grim determination on her face. "It's here, isn't it?" she said. I nodded, gasping for breath. "What do we do?" "Fire." She said it's the only thing that weakens it. Chris was shaking, his face pale. "We're going to die out here." "No, we're not," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We fight." Laura handed me a torch, lighting it with hers. The Wendigo emerged moments later, its movements jerky and unnatural. It circled us, growling, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "Hold your ground," Laura said. "Don't let it separate us." The creature lunged. Faster than I could react, Laura swung her torch. The flames grazed its side, and it screeched, recoiling. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard. Chris panicked, dropping his torch and bolting into the woods. "Chris, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The Wendigo turned, chasing after him. "Stay here," I told Laura, running after my friend. I found Chris slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. The Wendigo stood over him, its claws poised. I didn't think. I just acted, swinging my torch with all my strength. The flames caught its arm, and it howled, retreating into the shadows. Chris looked up at me, his eyes glassy. "Evan," he whispered. "It's inside my head. I can't stop it." "You're fine," I said, pulling him to his feet. "We're getting out of here." We made it back to Laura, but Chris wasn't the same. He muttered incoherently, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things I couldn't. "We have to go," Laura said. "Now." The three of us ran, the Wendigo's growls following us all the way to the RV. When we finally reached it, I shoved Chris inside and slammed the door. Laura and I collapsed, exhausted, but something felt wrong. Chris was silent, sitting in the corner, his head bowed. I approached cautiously. "Chris?" I said. He looked up, smiling, a cold, unnatural smile. "You can't escape," he said, his voice distorted. The Wendigo's reflection gleamed in his eyes. We drove away, leaving the gorge behind, but the claw marks on the RV side were a stark reminder of what we'd faced. Chris didn't speak again. His smile was frozen, his eyes distant. As we crossed the state line, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the forest watching us. We survived, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. My name's Carter Phillips. It was 2007, and I was on my third night RV camping just outside the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from Mono Lake. Now, I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, I was more of a stay inside, sip on something warm kind of guy. But a divorce and a midlife crisis will drive you to some weird places. After a decade of city noise, I figured a solo RV trip into the mountains might clear my head. Turns out that kind of peace and quiet isn't always as comforting as you'd think. I'd parked my RV at one of those smaller, secluded campsites where you're more likely to find deer than people, which was kind of the point. The first couple of nights were uneventful. Just me, a few beers, and some bad attempts at cooking over a campfire. I'd been telling myself it was the perfect kind of escape, though I'll admit that by night 3, the isolation had started to feel a little less peaceful and more claustrophobic. But what was I going to do? Pack up and head back to the city? Nah, that would have felt like losing. Plus, I was still trying to get used to sleeping in an RV without the constant hum of city life around me. Everything out there was too still. Every tiny crack in the forest made my skin crawl. But hey, what's a little discomfort compared to proving to myself I wasn't totally losing my edge at 42? That night, as I was lying on the RV bed, scrolling through some half-downloaded articles on my phone, I noticed the light outside flicker. Not a campfire glow, something sharper, more precise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a reflection of something metallic in the distance. But it happened again, this time closer. I sat up, listening. I wasn't one of those paranoid types, but when you're out alone in the mountains, your mind has a way of turning normal things into, well, not so normal things. For a while, nothing happened. The wind rustled the leaves, an owl hooted off in the distance, the kind of noises you should expect in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was about to let it go and settle back into my semi-uncomfortable RV bed, there was a sound. Not the wind, not some critter scurrying about. This was the distinct crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the trees just beyond my RV. I slid out of bed and peered out the tiny RV window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the pitch-black woods and the faint silhouette of my truck parked beside the RV. But then there it was, a figure standing still, halfway between the trees and my vehicle. At first, I figured it was just another camper who'd wandered over to the wrong site, but then I realized there wasn't supposed to be anyone else this far out. I didn't even hear the sound of another RV or car coming in earlier. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure stood there frozen, almost like it was waiting for something. They were tall, lanky, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, but something felt off. My gut was telling me this wasn't just some lost hiker, and you don't ignore gut feelings out here. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating before I opened the RV door. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't own a gun, never really saw the need in the city, and honestly, I'd thought the RV would provide enough protection from whatever the woods had to offer. You know, deer, maybe a curious bear or something, not a strange man lurking outside. The moment I stepped outside, the figure bolted fast. I shined my flashlight in the direction they ran, catching a glimpse of a dirty face, long stringy hair, and something like a wild grin flashing in the dark. But before I could process it, they were gone, disappearing into the thick trees. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that maybe it was just some vagrant who didn't want trouble. But when I got back inside, something had changed. The flashlight beam caught a reflection on the passenger seat of my RV. My heart sank when I saw it, a large hunting knife jammed into the seat. It wasn't mine. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I have missed someone sneaking into my RV? I couldn't tell you. Maybe I had dozed off earlier, or maybe this guy was just good at what he did. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't alone, and whoever this guy was, he had keys. I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the Rangers, but of course, out here there was no signal. So, like any rational person, I locked every door and window, grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I had, a camping hatchet, and sat in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the tree line. I wasn't planning on staying the night anymore. First light. I was getting the hell out of there, but first light didn't come fast enough. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my adrenaline, because the next thing I knew, it was around 2 a.m. and the entire RV shook. It wasn't a tree falling or some kind of animal bumping into it. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, clutching the hatchet, and shouted out, hoping to scare them off, but the pounding didn't stop. When the door finally flew open, it wasn't subtle. The figure from earlier barreled in wildly and grinning, holding a crowbar. There was no conversation, no demands. He lunged at me immediately, swinging the crowbar, catching me off guard. I swung back with the hatchet, but missed. He was faster than I expected. I won't bore you with the gory details, but let's just say it wasn't one of those quick, clean self-defense moments you see in the movies. I got some good hits in, but not before he bashed me pretty good with the crowbar. Blood was everywhere. His, mine. It all blended together in the chaos. At some point, we both fell out of the RV and the fight spilled onto the ground. I don't know how, but I got the upper hand, slamming the hatchet down into his chest. The fight stopped then, just like that. I remember standing over him, gasping for air, not really registering what had happened until I saw the light dimming in his wild eyes. He was gone. I staggered back into the RV, dazed, bloody, and in shock. I locked myself inside, not knowing what else to do. Calling for help wasn't an option out here, so I waited. Just me, the dead guy outside, and the silence of the forest. By the time morning rolled around, I was still wide awake, eyes fixed on the body outside. I don't know why I hadn't moved it. Maybe I just needed the daylight to confirm it wasn't some sick nightmare. Eventually, I stepped out, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I searched the man's pockets, half expecting to find nothing. But there it was, his wallet. His name was Warren Gibson. He was wanted in 3 states for murder, and here I was, alone with his body, no cell service, and a whole mess of questions that I didn't have the answers to. The cops eventually found me that afternoon after a couple of hikers came across my bloodied RV and freaked out. They took one look at me, the body, and started asking the usual questions. I don't even remember half of what I told them, just that it was self-defense, which, to be fair, was the truth. Turns out Warren had been squatting in the mountains for years, preying on isolated campers. They'd been looking for him for a long time. Funny thing is, I'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, to find some peace and quiet. I ended up right in the middle of someone else's nightmare. Still, all things considered, I guess I got off easy. I'd been driving for hours, the narrow desert highway stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was a golden orb sinking behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery hues. My RV rattled as the pavement turned to dirt, the road leading me deeper into the vast, silent expanse of Canyon Hollow. This was where I wanted to be, alone, surrounded by nothing but red rock and the occasional shriek of a hawk. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace, or at least distraction. 6 months had passed since the accident, but the guilt was as raw as ever. I should have been more careful. I couldn't escape that thought, no matter how far I drove. Canyon Hollow was famous for its petroglyphs, remnants of an ancient people whose art told stories of life, death, and something in between. It was also infamous for its mysteries, tales of settlers who vanished, of travelers who never made it out. But I didn't believe in that sort of thing. History was history, nothing more. I pulled into the campground as dusk settled, parking near the edge of the canyon. There were only 2 other campers, an older couple in a beat-up RV several spots down. They waved as I stepped out, and I gave them a nod. The silence of the desert was almost unnerving, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears. I shook it off and set up camp, promising myself a good night's rest before exploring the next day. That first night I dreamed of the accident. I was back on the ridge, the rocks crumbling beneath my feet. I heard Alex shouting, his voice raw with panic. My hands reached out for him, but I wasn't fast enough. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the RV as it settled into the cool desert air. I stepped outside for some fresh air. The moon hung high, casting long shadows over the red rocks. I could see the older couple's RV, their lights off. Beyond them, the canyon stretched out, an ocean of darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint voice carried on the wind. "Ethan." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Alex's. Impossible, I told myself. Just a trick of the wind. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void, before retreating to the safety of the RV. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was bright, and the desert looked almost friendly in the daylight. I packed a bag with water and snacks and set off to explore the petroglyphs. The trail was rugged, winding through narrow canyons and open plains dotted with junipers. The carvings appeared in clusters, etched into the stone with astonishing precision. Animals, spirals, figures locked in what looked like dances or battles. Then I found the symbols. Unlike the other carvings, these were jagged and erratic, spirals that twisted into themselves like whirlpools. They didn't fit with the rest of the art. Standing there, I felt a chill despite the sun. It wasn't just the symbols, it was the silence. No birds, no wind, just me and the rocks. When I got back to camp, the older couple's RV was gone. At first I thought that they'd left while I was out, but their spot was wrong. Their folding chairs were still there, along with a cooler and a half-empty coffee mug. Their fire pit had ashes that were still warm. I walked over, calling out, but no one answered. The RV keys were sitting on the folding table, as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. A heavy unease settled over me, but I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd gone for a hike. Maybe they'd gotten a ride into town. But as night fell, the unease turned into something closer to fear. The wind picked up after sundown, howling through the canyon like a living thing. I sat inside the RV, trying to focus on anything but the emptiness outside. That's when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on my passenger seat, leather-bound and worn. I hadn't seen it there before. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the entries chronicling the travels of someone who had camped here before me. At first, the notes were mundane, descriptions of the canyon, complaints about the heat, but as the entries went on, they grew darker. Something is out there. I see shadows at night, faces in the mirrors. I thought I was alone, but I'm not. They're watching me. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. Don't let them in. No matter what you hear, don't let them in. I snapped the journal shut, my hands trembling. The RV groaned as the wind buffeted it, and for a moment I thought I heard a knock at the door. Just the wind, I told myself. But then it came again, louder. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the ridge down to my RV. My stomach turned. That night, I barricaded the door with everything I could find. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers started around midnight, faint at first, then louder. They called my name, voices I recognized but couldn't place. Alex was one of them. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth until the sun came up. The next day I decided to leave. I packed up as fast as I could and started the engine, relief flooding me when it roared to life. But as I drove toward the exit, the road twisted and looped, always bringing me back to the campground. I tried every direction, but it was no use. It was like the canyon wouldn't let me go. Desperation drove me back to the petroglyphs. I followed the spirals, hoping they held some kind of answer. The silence was crushing now, the air heavy with dread. And then I saw it. A wagon train, fully intact, crossing the canyon in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, but as I got closer, the figures became clearer, men, women, and children in 19th century clothing. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate. I shouted, waving my arms, but they didn't react. As I approached, they vanished, leaving only skeletal remains of wagons and rusted tools in their wake. That night they came for me. I sat in the RV, knife in hand, as shadows moved outside. The voices were louder now, pleading and accusing all at once. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Alex's voice cut through the din, filled with anger and sorrow. The windows fogged as hollow faces pressed against the glass, their empty eye sockets weeping black tears. They began to bang on the walls, the door shaking on its hinges. "You can't hide," they whispered. "You belong here with us." I thought of the journal, of its warning not to let them in. But the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with guilt and regret. I clutched the knife, my knuckles white. Then I remembered the spirals. The petroglyphs had to mean something, a way out, a key. I grabbed Alex's compass, the only keepsake I had of him, and bolted from the RV. The shadows followed, their whispers echoing through the canyon. I reached the spirals and fell to my knees, holding the compass above the carvings. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Alex." The air grew still. The shadows stopped moving. One by one, they dissolved into the canyon mist, their voices fading into silence. The compass grew warm in my hand before falling still. The road was clear. The next morning, I didn't question it. I drove until the canyon was a distant memory, the horizon opening up before me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching, that someday, somewhere, the whispers will start again. Nobody tells you that being a small-town cop is just glorified babysitting, not until you're knee-deep in chasing down some idiot for stealing lawn chairs off his neighbor's porch. My name's Jacob Spivey. I've been patrolling the streets of Silver Grove, Ohio, for the better part of 10 years. Not a long time, but long enough to get a feel for the place, know everyone by their first name, and learn which drunk idiots you're going to have to drag out of the bar after a Browns game. It was 1997, a year that stuck with me for a lot of reasons, mostly because it was the year everything went sideways, way sideways. Small towns have their secrets, sure, but nothing like this. So it all started when the calls came in about a group of kids gone missing. Typical small-town stuff, you'd think. Kids wandering off into the woods to do whatever it is kids do these days. Hell, I remember sneaking into the woods as a kid myself. But this was different. It wasn't just a couple of teenagers disappearing after a Saturday night. We were talking 4 kids, all under the age of 12. They were out for a camping trip with some Boy Scout group, and nobody had seen them since they wandered away from the campfire. Naturally, I got called in along with my partner, Jared Granger. Granger, bless his soul, was as reliable as a broken flashlight, but he had a good heart, even if it was buried under layers of bad jokes and self-doubt. We headed out to where the kids were last seen, right at the edge of Fox Hollow Woods, a stretch of thick forest that everyone in town avoided, mostly because of the rumors. You've heard of the creepy stories, right? Every town has them. Fox Hollow had its share. The old-timers used to talk about strange animals, twisted things that shouldn't exist, lurking deep in the woods. Kids would swear they saw shadows moving just outside their vision. Me? I figured it was just the usual nonsense. You hear something enough times and it loses its edge. We spent the better part of the morning trudging through the woods, calling out the kids' names, hoping they'd come running. Nothing. No sign of them, not even a footprint or a half-eaten sandwich. And then Granger, in his infinite wisdom, decided to crack a joke. "Maybe they got snatched by Bigfoot, Spivey," he said, chuckling to himself. I ignored him. Granger had a habit of cracking jokes when things got tense, but even he started to get quiet when we found the first clue. At least, what we thought was a clue. About a mile in, we stumbled across an old, beat-up tent. Looked like it had been there for years. Inside, we found a pile of old bones, picked clean. Not human, thank God, but something about it gave me the creeps. I radioed back to the station, told them we'd found a campsite, but no sign of the kids. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, telling us to keep searching, so we did. We went deeper into Fox Hollow than I ever had before. Granger was quiet by now, his usual jokes replaced with nervous glances over his shoulder. It was late afternoon when we found something I still can't explain. There was this clearing, completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. In the center of the clearing was a small mound, like someone had piled up dirt and left it there. It wasn't the mound that bothered me, though. It was what was on top of it. A pile of shoes, tiny shoes, like the kind you'd see on kids. Some of them were old, dirty, covered in mud, while others looked practically new, like they'd just been worn yesterday. My stomach turned, and Granger looked like he was about to be sick. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," Granger muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We were standing there trying to figure out what to do next when we heard something, a rustling sound like leaves being dragged across the ground. We both turned at the same time, and that's when we saw it. Or him, I guess. At first I thought it was a man, just some vagrant who'd been living in the woods too long. He was hunched over, his back bent in a way that didn't seem natural. His arms were too long, his skin stretched thin, and his head, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It looked like he was wearing a mask, but it wasn't a mask. His face was twisted, contorted, like it had been melted and reshaped into something almost human, but not quite. He didn't move right either. It was like he was learning how to walk all over again. Jerky movements, his head twitching from side to side as he shuffled toward us. My hand went straight to my holster, but Granger was frozen. Couldn't blame him. I was terrified too. But cops don't get paid to be scared, so I yelled out, "Stop, police!" The thing didn't stop. It just kept coming. Slow at first, but then it broke into a run, barreling toward us faster than anything that should be able to move on two legs. I pulled my gun, fired twice, dead center. It should have dropped, but it didn't. Just kept coming. Granger finally snapped out of it, pulled his gun too, and we both unloaded on this thing. But it was like shooting at air. It didn't even flinch. I wish I could say we stood our ground, acted like the tough cops we were supposed to be, but I'd be lying. We ran. We ran like hell, crashing through the trees, barely able to keep our footing. That thing, it chased us. But it wasn't just following us, it was toying with us, cutting us off, herding us in one direction, deeper into the woods. We finally made it to a stream, and I dove into it, figuring that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't follow us into the water. Granger was right behind me, gasping for air. I'll never forget the look on his face, the terror that had replaced his usual cocky grin. "Did you see it?" Granger whispered, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. We stayed there in the water for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. It was getting dark by the time we finally crawled out and made our way back to the road. By then, I was starting to think we'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe it was just some kind of mass hysteria. But then we found Granger's jacket. It was lying on the road, torn to shreds. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just his jacket, lying there like a forgotten piece of litter. We reported it, of course, told the chief what we'd seen, but you can imagine how that went. Nobody believed us. Missing kids, sure, but a monster in the woods? Yeah, right. We were told to take a few days off, clear our heads. But I couldn't clear my head. Neither could Granger. He stopped coming to work after that, said he was moving, getting the hell out of Silver Grove. Can't say I blame him. I stuck around, though. Someone had to figure out what happened to those kids. A week later, the bodies were found. Well, what was left of them. They were scattered through the woods, mauled, torn apart like roadkill. But it wasn't animals. No animal could do that. I know what we saw that day wasn't human, but nobody else does. Nobody else will. The thing that lives in Fox Hollow Woods, it's still out there, and it's not done yet. I pulled my RV into the secluded campsite just as the rain started. The drops pinged against the roof like tiny bullets, creating a rhythm that, under other circumstances, might have been calming. But as I stepped out into the chill, I felt anything but calm. The Columbia River Gorge was supposed to be beautiful, a place where you could lose yourself in nature and leave the chaos of the world behind. That's what I told myself when I agreed to take this assignment, a photography spread on the rare owls that called the gorge home. It wasn't just work. It was a way to connect with the wilderness my dad had loved so much. He'd been gone 3 months now, and I hadn't yet figured out how to deal with the silence he left behind. The gorge felt like a fitting tribute, the kind of place he'd have taken me as a kid, pointing out tracks in the dirt and birds in the canopy. But as I stood there, staring at the dark forest ahead, I felt more alone than ever. The first day wasn't so bad. The rain let up by mid-morning, and I managed to find a good spot to set up my camera near one of the gorge's many waterfalls. The cascading water was mesmerizing, its roar drowning out the world. And for a while, I forgot about everything else. That was until I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it had a rhythm to it, a cadence, words I couldn't make out, but that felt intentional. I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself, but the words didn't convince me. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, the rain came back with a vengeance. The RV rocked slightly in the wind, and the forest outside the windows turned into an impenetrable wall of black. I tried to focus on the images, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One shot in particular stood out, a photo of the waterfall. In the corner, faint but unmistakable, was a shadowy figure standing among the trees. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just the contrast of the water spray against the dark forest. But then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. At first they seemed far off, but they grew louder, closer, circling the RV. I turned off the light and peered out the window, but all I saw was the rain. The footsteps stopped, but the unease stayed with me long after I'd crawled into bed. The next day I ventured deeper into the forest, determined to shake off the previous night's paranoia. The gorge was breathtaking, its trails winding through dense greenery and past cliffs that offered stunning views of the river below. I lost myself in the work, snapping shots of moss-covered rocks and misty trees. That's when I found the carvings. They were etched into a cluster of boulders, spiraling symbols that looked ancient. I ran my fingers over one, noting how smooth it felt, as if it had been worn down by centuries of wind and rain. At the center of the largest carving was a stone, perfectly round and black as night. It almost seemed to pulse when I touched it. I pocketed the stone without thinking. Something about it felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. The forest felt heavier on the way back to the RV, the air thick with humidity, and something else I couldn't name. As I neared camp, I spotted a figure in the distance. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. The man didn't move. I took a step closer, but as I did, the figure dissolved into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I hurried back to the RV and locked the door behind me. That night, the rain stopped, but the forest outside was anything but quiet. The whispers came back, louder this time, accompanied by faint laughter, and then I heard his voice. Ethan. It was my dad, clear as day. "Dad," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Come here," the voice beckoned. It was coming from outside, pulling me toward the trees. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me knew it couldn't be real. Mark knew that opening that door would be a mistake. But the voice was so familiar, so comforting. It took every ounce of willpower I had to stay inside. The next morning, I woke to find the RV surrounded by a circle of stones. They were identical to the one I'd pocketed, each one perfectly smooth and black. My stomach dropped. As I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. And then I saw it. It stood on a rock, its form shrouded in shadow. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture too still. Its eyes glowed faintly like embers in a dying fire. "Leave what you took," the figure said, its voice gravely, deep and laced with menace. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. What are you?" The figure tilted its head as if studying me. "Leave what you took," it repeated before fading into the trees. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I considered leaving, but the RV's battery was dead, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I was trapped. That night the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows outside the RV seemed to move, twisting and contorting into impossible shapes. I clutched the black stone in my hand, suddenly certain it was the key to everything. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, stepping outside and holding the stone aloft. The Sandman appeared again, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "Leave what you took," it said, its voice echoing through the gorge. I threw the stone into the forest, my chest heaving. The Sandman didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the cliffs. "Come," it whispered. I didn't follow. Instead, I bolted back into the RV and slammed the door. The Sandman's form loomed outside, but it didn't approach. Instead, it simply stared, its eyes burning into me. Somehow, I managed to jump-start the RV. The next morning, as I drove out of the gorge, the weight that had pressed on me for days began to lift. But the memory of the Sandman stayed with me, its whispers echoing in my mind. Weeks later, as I developed my photos, I found something chilling in one shot, a stunning image of an owl perched on a branch. There was a shadow in the background, tall, humanoid, with glowing eyes. I haven't returned to the gorge since, but sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it again. Leave what you took. My name is Ellie Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I write for a travel magazine. This happened last October when I took my RV to Devil's River State Natural Area in Texas to research a piece for an article called Hidden Gems of Texas. I thought I was prepared for the isolation, the wilderness, and even the eerie stories about the place. I was wrong. What I experienced there still haunts me. I arrived late in the afternoon, my RV kicking up a cloud of dust as I drove along the unpaved road to the campground. Devil's River was stunning, crystal clear water winding through rocky terrain, flanked by sprawling desert vegetation. The remoteness was exactly what I was looking for. No cell service, no crowds, just nature in its purest form. After parking in a designated spot near the river, I stepped out to stretch and breathe in the crisp, dry air. That's when a sheriff's vehicle rolled up beside me. The man inside, a stocky, middle-aged man in a tan uniform, stepped out and tipped his hat. "You must be the writer," he said, his voice steady but friendly. "I'm Sheriff Hank Moreno. Just wanted to check in. Make sure you're set up okay." "Thanks," I said, brushing dust off my jeans. "Just got here. It's beautiful." "It is," he replied, his expression softening. "But it's also dangerous if you're not careful. This place gets real dark at night, and the river is deeper than it looks. Stick to the trails and don't wander too far after sundown." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, forcing a smile. "Good," he said, tipping his hat again before climbing back into his vehicle. "Welcome to Devil's River." As I set up my RV, I noticed another camper about 100 yards away. She had a small tent pitched by the river and a collection of gear that suggested she was staying longer than me. She waved as I passed, and I decided to introduce myself. "Hey, I'm Ellie." "Hey, I said, "here for the weekend." The woman smiled, brushing her curly hair out of her face. "Becky Turner. I'm here for as long as it takes." "As long as what takes?" I asked. "The Devil's Light," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "You've heard of it, right?" I shrugged. "Something about a glowing light? Sheriff didn't mention it." Becky nodded, her smile widening. "It's an old legend. People say it's a spirit that lures travelers into the wilderness. Some call it a will-o'-sire, the wisp. Others say it's the devil himself. I'm here to find out." I tried not to laugh. "So you're a ghost hunter?" "Amateur paranormal investigator," she corrected, "and Devil's River is one of the most active spots in Texas." I nodded politely, but her enthusiasm bordered on absurd. Still, she seemed harmless enough. That night, I set up my camera to capture the stars. The sky here was unlike anything I'd seen before, a vast canvas of shimmering light. Around midnight, as I adjusted the exposure, something caught my eye. A faint flickering light danced across the river. At first, I thought it was another camper's lantern, but it moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I grabbed my zoom lens and focused on the light. It appeared to hover above the water, shifting between white, yellow, and a strange bluish-green hue. "Ellie!" Becky's voice called out behind me, startling me. I turned to see her jogging toward me, flashlight in hand. "Did you see it?" she asked breathlessly. "The light?" I asked. "Yeah, what is it?" Becky's grin widened. "It's the Devil's Light. We have to follow it." I frowned. "Follow it? Isn't that the whole thing? People who follow it disappear." "That's the legend," she said. "But I'm here to figure out what's really going on. It's probably just gas or reflections, but imagine if it's something more." I hesitated, then shook my head. "I'm staying here. Good luck." Becky looked disappointed, but nodded. "Suit yourself." She headed toward the river, her flashlight bouncing with each step. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my unease growing. The next morning, I ran into Sheriff Moreno while hiking to a scenic overlook. He seemed relieved to see me still in one piece. "I see," he said. "Of course," I replied, though my tone lacked conviction. "Do you know anything about the Devil's Light?" His face darkened. "It's just a story. But I've had to search for enough people who went missing out here to know there's something off about this place. Stay close to camp, Ellie. Don't go chasing things you don't understand." I wanted to argue, to insist that I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about his tone stopped me. I nodded and promised to be careful. That evening, I sat by the river, scribbling notes for my article. The light returned, brighter and closer this time. It moved along the water's surface, then stopped, hovering just above the far bank. "Becky?" I called, but there was no answer. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to her campsite, only to find it abandoned. Her tent was still there, along with her equipment, but Becky was gone. Panic rose in my chest. "Becky!" I shouted into the night, my voice echoing across the canyon. The light flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard her voice. "Ellie, help me!" Without thinking, I stepped into the river, the cold water soaking my boots as I waded toward the sound. The further I walked, the brighter the light became, until it enveloped me entirely. I stopped, shielding my eyes, and realized I wasn't alone. Figures emerged within the light, shadows of people, their faces hollow and spectral. They reached out to me, their hands translucent and trembling. "Help us," they whispered in unison, their voices layered with desperation. I turned to run, but the water dragged at my legs, holding me in place. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with long, wet hair clinging to her face. It was Becky. "Ellie, please," she said, her voice cracking. "Don't leave me." "Becky," I whispered, my throat dry, her face twisted, her eyes darkening. "Stay with us," she said, her voice overlapping with the others. "Forever." Fear surged through me, and I fought against the water's grip. The light pulsed, growing brighter and hotter, as if it were alive. "No," I screamed, pulling myself free and stumbling back toward the shore. The whispers grew louder, turning into wails that echoed in my skull. When I reached the river bank, the light disappeared, plunging the area into silence. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart pounding. The next morning, Sheriff Moreno found me packing up my RV. I told him Becky was missing, and he nodded grimly. "Another one," he muttered under his breath. I debated telling him about the light, about the voices, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I handed him Becky's journal, which I'd found near her tent. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the light flicker behind me. I haven't written about Devil's River. Some stories aren't meant to be shared. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the light, and the whispers return. And I wonder if Becky's still out there waiting for someone else to answer her call. My name is Mark Hollis. I'm 42 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I was camping near Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. It was supposed to be a simple solo trip, a chance to rediscover my love for geology and shake off the lingering bitterness of my divorce. Instead, I encountered something that I can only describe as evil, and it changed the way I see the world and myself. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon after a long and tedious drive over rocky back roads. My RV's tires groaned as I forced it through trails that probably weren't meant for anything larger than an ATV. By the time I reached the edge of the sinkhole, I'd bent a rim and lost an hour to backtracking when I took a wrong turn. Still, the view was worth it. The sinkhole stretched wide and deep in the rocky landscape, its black maw gaping under the pale Texas sky. The guidebook said it was 400 feet deep, and as I stood at the edge, staring into the void, I could believe it. Hundreds of bats emerged from the darkness, their wings slicing through the evening air like whispers of another world. I set up camp close by, just outside the official boundaries of the protected area. The no trespassing signs didn't bother me much. I wasn't planning to do anything destructive. I just wanted a good vantage point for studying the rock formations and maybe capturing some drone footage. It was the perfect spot for inspiration, or so I thought. The first strange thing happened as I unpacked my gear. I'd brought a high-end drone to get detailed images of the sinkhole's interior, but it refused to power on. I charged it the night before, but now the battery was dead. When I swapped it for a spare, the drone buzzed to life, only to lose connection as soon as I tried to fly it over the sinkhole. "Damn signal interference," I muttered, though I couldn't see anything nearby that might have caused it. I shoved the drone aside and grabbed my camera instead. As I set up my tripod, the bats began to swarm out of the sinkhole in greater numbers. I froze, staring as their flight pattern shifted into something unnervingly deliberate. For a moment, they seemed to form the shape of a hand, claws extended before scattering into the twilight. I laughed uneasily, shaking off the feeling. "Just my imagination," I said out loud, though the words rang hollow. That night, as I lay in my RV, the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. I was used to the stillness of remote camping, but this was different. It was too quiet, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Then the noises started. At first it was just a faint groaning sound, like the wind rushing through the canyon, but as I listened, the groan turned into something deeper, almost like a voice. It was low and guttural, resonating from the direction of the sinkhole. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was my name. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and dry scrub. Still, the voice lingered in the back of my mind as though it had etched itself into my thoughts. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I found something unusual near the edge of the sinkhole. Partially buried in the dirt was an old weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were intact, filled with strange symbols and passages in a language I couldn't recognize. It looked ancient, and as I flipped through it, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The symbols seemed to shift on the page, their shapes warping and twisting as though they were alive. I should have left it there. I should have walked away, but curiosity got the better of me. I brought the book back to the RV, intending to research it later. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. "Mark!" The voice was clearer now, echoing from the direction of the sinkhole. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and malevolent. I stepped outside, clutching my flashlight, and froze. Near the edge of the sinkhole stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with horns that curved against the sky and eyes that glowed like embers. "Who's there?" I called, though my voice wavered. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those burning eyes. Then it raised one clawed hand and pointed to the book sitting on the RV's table. I backed away, my heart racing. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of its voice. Mark. The next few hours were a blur of panic and confusion. The voice grew louder, now coming from all around me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too quick to catch but too real to ignore. The RV's lights flickered wildly, plunging me into darkness before flaring back to life. Desperate for answers, I grabbed the book and began flipping through its pages. The symbols seemed to pulse, their shapes growing sharper and more menacing. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of the cryptic passages, but the language was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Then the shadows became solid. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and flickering like flames. They surrounded the RV, their eyes glowing red, their mouths whispering my name over and over. Mark, Mark, Mark. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the book and ran outside, the cold desert air biting at my skin. The figures closed in, their whispers growing into a deafening roar. "What do you want?" I screamed, clutching the book to my chest. The towering figure appeared again, rising from the sinkhole, like a shadow brought to life. Its voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath my feet. "You disturbed my domain," it said, its words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You brought the book. You must pay the price." Its clawed hand reached for me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. Then I remembered something. A line from an old myth about curses and spirits. "Burn the tether, and the curse will break." I didn't know if it would work, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my lighter, flicked it on, and held the flame to the book. The pages ignited, the fire spreading quickly as the symbols writhed and twisted in agony. The figures screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the book burned. The towering entity howled, its voice shaking the air before vanishing into the darkness. When it was over, I collapsed to the ground, trembling and gasping for breath. The desert was silent again. The oppressive weight lifted. I didn't wait for dawn. I packed up what I could and left the park, abandoning the RV when it refused to start. I don't know what I encountered at Devil's Sinkhole, but I'll never forget it. The images from that trip, the ones I managed to recover, show things I can't explain. Shadows that shouldn't be there. Shapes that defy reason. I've shared my story with a few people, but most don't believe me. Maybe I don't want them to. Some truths are better left buried. In the line of work I've chosen, I've had my fair share of encounters. As a small-town cop, there's no shortage of odd calls and minor incidents that could keep someone amused or curious for a while. My name is Garrett Dillard, and I've been working as a sheriff's deputy here in Ransomville, Wyoming, for about 8 years now. Let me tell you, small towns aren't always the quiet, uneventful places people think they are, especially not out here. It was 2014, mid-May. I remember it well because that was the year my brother moved to Oregon. We were always close, and it felt weird not having him just a few hours away anymore. It made me throw myself into my work even more than usual. We all cope in different ways, right? The day it all started was a Wednesday, and Wednesdays are usually slow. Maybe a speeder or someone leaving the bar a little too buzzed. That afternoon, though, dispatch came through with something that made me pause. A call about a missing farmer out on the outskirts of town. Henry Calloway. His wife, Lorraine, had called it in, worried because he hadn't come back for lunch, which wasn't like him. Normally, he'd be back by noon without fail. I figured it was just a case of Henry taking his time, maybe losing track of it while working on his fence or something. I pulled up to the Calloway farm around 1:30. The old wooden house looked like it had stood in place for over a century, probably because it had. Lorraine was out front, her arms crossed, looking worried. She's a tough woman, not one to overreact, so her being that upset told me something was off. "Hey, Lorraine," I said as I climbed out of the cruiser. "You've seen Henry anywhere?" "No, Garrett, I haven't," she replied, her voice shaky. "He was out back near the woods fixing that damn fence again, but he's been gone for hours now." The woods. Always the woods. I sighed, looking out toward the tree line. It was dense and dark, a familiar sight in these parts. "All right, let's not panic yet. I'll go check it out." Lorraine nodded, wringing her hands. I didn't like it. Something about the way she was acting put me on edge, but I wasn't about to let her know that. I grabbed a flashlight from my cruiser, despite it being broad daylight, and made my way through the pasture. The fence lines snaked along the back of their property, right up against the woods. The grass was tall, swaying in the breeze, and I felt the familiar crunch of it beneath my boots as I walked. The sun had started to dip just a little, casting everything in that odd afternoon glow. As I neared the tree line, I called out for Henry. No answer. Typical. The fence was there, all right, half fixed, with a pile of tools scattered around as if Henry had just dropped them mid-job. My first thought was maybe he'd gone chasing after a cow that wandered off. It wasn't unheard of, but that didn't explain why he'd leave his tools behind like that. "Henry?" I shouted again, stepping into the shade of the trees. Nothing. Just the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a crow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I hated the feeling creeping up my spine. I'd been in those woods 100 times, but suddenly it felt different. Unnatural, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I pushed deeper into the trees, keeping my flashlight pointed ahead, even though the sunlight still filtered through the canopy. About 50 yards in, I found something that made me go cold, a large, deep gash in the earth, almost like something had been dragged through the dirt. I crouched down to get a closer look, and that's when I noticed the blood, dried, dark, and smeared along the edge of the track. My gut twisted. This wasn't an animal attack. I'd seen those before, and this was different. Calculated, deliberate. I followed the trail of blood further into the woods, my pulse quickening with each step. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I couldn't stop now. The trail led me to a clearing. It was a small patch of land surrounded by trees with an eerie stillness hanging over it. At first, I didn't see anything, but as I stepped closer, the smell hit me, a rancid, metallic odor that made my stomach turn. Then I saw him. Henry's body was lying in the middle of the clearing, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His chest had been torn open, but there was something strange about the wounds. They weren't clean. They weren't the kind of wounds you'd see from an animal or even a human. They were jagged, uneven, like something had been clawing at him, and whatever it wasn't done neatly. I stood frozen for a moment, just staring. I'd seen dead bodies before, car crashes, farm accidents, but this was different. This was brutal. I reached for my radio, my hand shaking as I called it in. "Dispatch, I need backup. I found Henry Calloway. He's dead." There was a pause on the other end, and then the dispatcher's voice came through. "Roger that, Garrett. Sending backup now. Are you okay?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice sounding hollow. "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I felt something watching me. It wasn't paranoia. I'd grown up in these woods, spent years patrolling them. I knew when something wasn't right, and right now, every fiber of my being was screaming at me to get out of there. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. For a moment I saw nothing, just the trees and the shifting shadows. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A flash of something pale, something large, ducking behind the trees. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, my hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm. Nothing. I knew better than to go chasing shadows, but I also knew I couldn't just stand there. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees, and started making my way back toward the pasture. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't a growl, not exactly, but it was deep and vibrating through the air, making the ground feel unsteady beneath my feet. It was closer than I'd expected. I turned my flashlight, flicking it across the trees, and there it was. Standing in the shadows between two massive pines was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, with a pale, leathery hide that looked like it had been stretched too thin over its bones. Its arms were long, almost too long, hanging down to its knees, ending in thick, twisted claws. Its head was oversized, lopsided, and misshapen, reminding me of those deep-sea fish you see in documentaries, the ones with the giant mouths. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from the darkness. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, trying to rationalize it as a bear or a big wolf or anything that made sense. But it wasn't. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It took a step forward, slow and deliberate, its claws scraping against the bark of the tree next to it. My heart pounded in my ears and my hand tightened on the grip of my pistol. I didn't wait for it to make the next move. I fired a single shot, aimed center mass. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the trees, but the creature didn't drop. It let out a strange, high-pitched sound, almost like it was laughing. My blood ran cold. I fired again, 3 more shots, but it barely flinched. It took another step forward, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted through the trees, the sound of that thing's movements thundering behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I burst out of the woods and into the pasture, Lorraine was standing on the porch, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't stop. I ran straight to my cruiser, jumped in and slammed the door shut. "What happened?" she called out, but I couldn't answer her. I couldn't find the words. I radioed dispatch again, telling them to hurry. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later, but by then everything was quiet again. No sounds from the woods, no sign of the creature, just the eerie stillness that had settled over the farm. We found Henry's body just as I'd left it. The coroner said it was some kind of animal attack. but no one could figure out what kind of animal could do something like that. And as for the creature, well, I didn't stick around long enough to get a good look at it again. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing in the woods, watching me. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. The next morning, the sheriff's department was buzzing with rumours. Word spreads fast in small towns, and Ransomville was no different. The official report called it an unidentified animal attack, but everyone could tell from the way I avoided talking about it that something more had happened. There was a look people gave me, half curious, half scared, like they wanted to ask me what really went down out there, but didn't want to hear the answer. The coroner, Dr. Clyde Jenkins, pulled me aside later that afternoon. He's one of those no-nonsense guys, the type that's seen just about everything, but even he seemed shaken up by Henry's condition. "Garrett," he said, his voice low, "I've been doing this job for 35 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The wounds on Henry's body, they don't match anything I know. Not a bear, not a wolf, not any predator native to these parts." He paused, rubbing his chin as if thinking twice about saying the next part. "And those tracks near the body, they weren't animal either. More like something upright, like a person." I tried not to let my face betray what I already knew. "You think someone did this?" He shook his head. "No human did this, Garrett, but it wasn't just some wild animal either. Whatever it was, it's not something we've encountered before." "Yeah," I muttered, not wanting to say anything more. "Thanks, Doc." I left the station soon after, taking a patrol car out along the edge of the forest where the Calloway farm backed up. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe I thought I'd catch another glimpse of that thing. Or maybe part of me hoped I'd find nothing at all, that I could convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I sat there, staring into the tree line, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel, I knew I wasn't going to get that kind of peace. A part of me wanted to head back into the woods, armed this time with something bigger than my standard-issue sidearm. I'd thought about grabbing a rifle from the station's armory, but it felt pointless. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't scared of bullets. As the days passed, the official investigation into Henry's death wrapped up, but the town didn't forget. People talked about the unusual circumstances behind the attack, and some even claimed to have heard strange noises at night, noises they'd never heard before. A few folks even reported livestock going missing, but I didn't follow up on those calls. I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen. It was about a week later when Lorraine Calloway came into the station. I was working the late shift, the kind of shift where the minutes crawl by and you start thinking about every bad decision you've ever made. Lorraine looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red, her hair disheveled, and she had this haunted look about her. "Garrett," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to show you something." I raised an eyebrow, not liking the sound of that. "What is it?" "It's out by the barn," she replied. "It came back." I froze. The way she said it made my stomach drop. I grabbed my coat and followed her out to her truck. The drive back to the farm was quiet, the tension thick between us. I could feel her fear, and I could feel my own creeping back in too. Whatever had killed Henry wasn't done yet. When we arrived at the farm, Lorraine led me toward the barn. It was dark now, with only the thin light from a crescent moon illuminating the yard. I had my flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the night as we approached the old wooden building. The smell hit me first, something sour and metallic, like the scent of rotting meat. Lorraine pointed toward the side of the barn, where the doors hung ajar. "It's in there," she said, her voice trembling. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The flashlight's beam swept across the floor, and then I saw it. There were more tracks, similar to the ones I'd found in the woods, large, clawed, and too deep for something just wandering through. They led toward a pile of hay in the corner, where something massive was shifting beneath the straw. I drew my pistol, my hand shaking slightly. "Stay behind me," I whispered to Lorraine, though I wasn't sure why. If that thing was here, I didn't stand a chance. The pile moved again, and then slowly something began to rise out of the hay. It was the creature, no doubt about it. Its pale, stretched skin glistened in the dim light, and it stood even taller than I remembered. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its claws twitching. But something was different. Its movements were slower, more laboured. I could see its chest heaving with each breath, as if it was struggling. I raised my gun, aiming right at its centre mass again, but before I could pull the trigger, the creature did something that made my blood run cold. It dropped something from its claws. It was a body. Another body, but this time it wasn't Henry. It was a young man, maybe in his 20s, dressed in ragged clothes. His face was gaunt, and his skin was pale like he'd been dead for days. But when I looked closer, I realized something horrible. He wasn't dead. He was still breathing, just barely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and there were deep gashes all over him, just like Henry. The creature let out a wet, rasping sound, and for the first time I realized it wasn't just some mindless beast. It was intelligent. It had brought this man here for a reason. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. This thing wasn't just killing for food. It was keeping them alive. It was hunting, but it was hunting in a way that suggested it was far more intelligent than I'd given it credit for. I didn't have time to think. The creature turned toward me, its claws raised. I fired 3 shots this time, aiming for its head. The bullets struck home, and the creature staggered back, collapsing into the pile of hay with a sickening thud. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the unmoving body. The thing was dead. This time, for real. I could feel it. Lorraine stepped forward, her face pale. Is it over? I looked down at the creature, then back at the young man who was still breathing, barely clinging to life. Yeah, I said, my voice steady. It's over. We called for an ambulance, and the young man was taken to the hospital. He survived, but he couldn't remember much of what had happened to him. Just that he'd been taken, dragged into the woods, and then everything went black. The creature's body didn't vanish, and it didn't disappear. The authorities took it away, but no one ever released a statement on what it was. People in town stopped asking questions too. They knew something wasn't right, but they didn't want to know the details. And as for me, I kept going, showing up to work every day like nothing had changed. But things had changed. The woods felt different now. They felt like they were hiding something bigger, something darker. But whatever that thing was, I know one thing for sure, it wasn't alone. People think living on the road in an RV is freedom, and maybe it is for the right kind of person. For me, it was less about freedom and more about necessity. My marriage had imploded 6 months ago, leaving me with a pile of bills and a suffocating apartment I could barely afford. So I sold what I could, bought an old RV off Craigslist, and decided to hit the road. I wasn't looking for adventure. I was looking for peace, somewhere I could just be. That's how I ended up in Lost Creek Wilderness in Colorado, a place that felt as isolated as I wanted to be. I'd read about it online, miles of granite formations, dense forests, and a winding creek that lived up to its name by disappearing underground, only to reappear miles later. It sounded perfect. I parked my RV in a clearing near the creek. There were no other campers around, not a tent, not a car, just me in the wilderness. The silence was almost too much at first. No hum of traffic, no distant sounds of people, just the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent my first day hiking and fishing. The trail was rugged but beautiful, and the trout in the creek were practically jumping into my hands. As I cooked one over my campfire that evening, I finally felt a flicker of what I'd been chasing. Contentment, the kind that comes when you're far enough from everything to forget your troubles. But that night, I noticed the silence again. It was different now. Oppressive, the kind that presses on your chest and makes every little noise stand out. My RV creaked in the cold mountain air, the sound loud enough to make me flinch. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest, but then came the footsteps. I sat bolt upright in bed, holding my breath. They were slow, deliberate, circling the RV. A bear, I thought, or maybe a deer, but they sounded too heavy for that, too purposeful. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and peered out the window. Nothing, just the dark silhouettes of trees and the faint glimmer of moonlight on the creek. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it was worse now, charged, like the air before a storm. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The next morning I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The forest could play tricks on your ears. Still, as I stepped outside, something felt off. My hiking boots, which I'd left neatly by the RV door, were gone. I searched the clearing, my frustration growing. I finally found them downstream, soaked and muddy, wedged between two rocks. I hadn't been near the creek since the day before, and even if I had, why would I throw my boots in the water? I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was my own stupidity, but the unease stayed with me. Later, while hiking a different trail, I came across something stranger, carvings on the rocks near the creek, deep, jagged lines that formed symbols I didn't recognize. They didn't look natural, but they weren't clean enough to be man-made either. They gave me the same tight-chested feeling I'd had the night before, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The electrical problems started that evening. The RV's lights flickered as I cooked dinner, and the heater sputtered before going dead completely. I wasn't too worried. I was a mechanic by trade and could usually patch things up. But as I worked on the wiring, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the woods, dark and endless. I told myself to get a grip, but the feeling didn't go away. When I stepped outside to grab a tool from the storage compartment, I saw something that stopped me cold. A trail of stones led from the RV to the creek, perfectly spaced, almost deliberate. I hadn't put them there. That night, the footsteps came back, louder this time and accompanied by something else, a scraping sound like nails on metal. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and opened the RV door. The beam of light swept across the clearing, catching only trees and shadows. But then, just at the edge of the woods, I saw it. A figure. It stood motionless, half hidden behind a tree. Its limbs were too long, its shape all wrong, and its eyes, God, its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the light like an animal's. My throat went dry as it stepped forward, just enough for me to see the unnatural way it moved, like it didn't fully understand how to walk. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like the forest itself was holding in its breath. The next morning, I found claw marks on the RV door, deep, jagged gouges that hadn't been there the day before. My first instinct was to leave, to pack up and drive until I reached the nearest town. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, drained completely overnight. Panic began to creep in, but I forced it down. I could fix this. I'd fixed worse. I spent the day trying to jump-start the engine with a makeshift generator I'd rigged up, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I glanced toward the trees, I half expected to see the figure again. That afternoon, I found an old journal tucked into a crevice near the creek. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Inside were handwritten entries from someone who had camped here before me. The first few pages were normal, notes about the weather, the scenery, but the tone shifted quickly. There's something in the woods. It doesn't want me here. I see it at night, watching from the trees. The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting messier. The last one sent a chill through me. It's in the clearing. I can't leave. If you find this, go. Leave while you still can. That night, the thing came closer. I was sitting by the fire, knife in hand, when I saw it again. This time it didn't stay at the edge of the trees. It stepped into the clearing, its movement slow and deliberate. The firelight illuminated its form, a twisted skeletal figure with impossibly long arms and legs. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face, it didn't have a face, just smooth, featureless skin and those terrible, glowing eyes. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? The RV wouldn't start, and the nearest road was miles away. The thing moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally as if pulled by invisible strings. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a dry branch from the fire and swung it, the flames flaring as they caught the air. The creature hissed a guttural, inhuman sound and backed away, retreating into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I made one last attempt to jump-start the RV. My hands were trembling as I connected the wires, silently praying for the engine to turn over. When it finally roared to life, I almost cried. I didn't even bother packing up. I left the campsite as it was, speeding down the dirt road with the RV shaking beneath me. My heart didn't stop racing until I hit pavement, and even then I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those glowing eyes chasing me. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't set foot in the wilderness since. The RV still has claw marks on the door, a reminder of how close I came to whatever that thing was. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I feel it again. That oppressive silence, the sense of being watched. And sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, I think I see it, waiting, watching. Maybe I never really left Lost Creek. Maybe part of me is still there, standing in the clearing, staring into the trees. Or maybe it followed me. The drive through Oregon was supposed to be simple. I was heading up from Boise to see my brother in Eugene, something I'd done plenty of times. It was 2011, and my old Chevy truck was holding up better than I was. After working long shifts at the warehouse, I had taken the trip to clear my head and catch up with family. My name's Randy Marlin, by the way, and I've worked pretty much every hard labor job you can imagine since I was 16. Grew up in Idaho, moved around. Nothing exciting about that. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains when I made the decision that would change everything. My phone's GPS signal dropped somewhere past Bend, and instead of turning around like any sensible person would, I decided to wing it. I figured I'd cut through some back roads to shave time off my drive, convinced I knew the way. Bad move. The paved road eventually turned to gravel, then dirt. The trees pressed closer to the truck, and I started to get a little uneasy. It wasn't immediate, more like a low, creeping feeling in the back of my mind. You know, of the kind. The deeper I went, the less sure I became that I was still heading in the right direction. The old map in my glove compartment wasn't much help. It was tattered and about 10 years out of date, but I pressed on because I'm stubborn like that. About an hour later, I realized I was well and truly lost. I hadn't seen another car for miles, not even a trailhead or sign, just dense forest all around me. It didn't help that the fuel gauge was creeping closer to empty, and it was getting darker by the minute. I considered turning back, but the narrow, winding path didn't make it easy to reverse. I finally pulled over when the dirt road became too uneven for my old truck to handle. Getting stuck out here seemed like a worse idea than just walking to see if I could get my bearings. The night was closing in, and I was in the middle of nowhere. Grabbing a flashlight from my backpack, I figured I'd walk a bit, find some sort of landmark, and head back. The air was thick, smelled of pine and wet earth, and the deeper I walked, the more I noticed how dead quiet it was. No birds, no insects, not even the wind through the trees, just nothing. It felt unnatural, but I shook it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. After walking for what felt like hours, I stumbled upon what looked like an old cabin tucked away behind thick undergrowth. It wasn't marked on my map. Hell, the map didn't show anything this far in. The place had probably been abandoned for years, but at that moment it seemed like shelter or a place to get my bearings. I stepped closer, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The cabin looked like it had been built sometime in the 50s, maybe earlier. The windows were cracked or broken, and the roof sagged, but the door was intact. I knocked out of habit, though I didn't expect anyone to answer. Nothing. Pushing the door open, the smell hit me first, stale, like something had been rotting in there for ages. My flashlight swept over old furniture, dust-covered shelves, and what looked like an old deer carcass by the corner. It had clearly been there for a while. There was something off about the place, beyond the smell, beyond the decay. It felt watched, like eyes were on me from the moment I stepped inside. I don't spook easy, but something in me said to leave. Just turn around, walk back to the truck, and call it quits. But I was curious. That was another mistake. At the back of the cabin, I found a door leading to what looked like a basement. The door itself was old but reinforced, with scratches running down it like someone or something had been trying to claw its way out or in. I hesitated. The smart thing would have been to leave, but my gut told me that whatever was down there might explain why the place felt so wrong. I opened the door, and a rank smell spilled out, sour, like decay and mold. It took everything in me not to gag. The stairs were steep and narrow. My flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness as I descended. The air was colder down here, damp, and the silence that had been so unnerving above was even worse below. When I reached the bottom, I could make out shapes in the dark, shelves lined with jars, rusted tools hanging on the walls, and something in the far corner that I couldn't quite make out. As I stepped closer, the smell got stronger, more pungent. It was then that my light flickered and revealed what lay ahead. Bodies. At least a dozen, piled in a corner, half covered by rotting sheets. Some looked like they'd been there for years, skeletal remains with tattered clothes hanging off their bones. Others were fresher, their skin bloated and mottled. But it wasn't just the bodies that made my stomach churn. It was the way they were arranged, like someone had been keeping them as trophies. I froze, the reality of what I was seeing sinking in. This wasn't some old abandoned cabin. This was a killing ground. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. Whoever or whatever had done this was still here, and now I was too. I didn't even have time to think. I just ran, bolting up the stairs. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop to see who or what had been down there. I just sprinted back through the trees the way I'd come, praying I could find the truck before it found me. But the woods weren't as empty as I thought. I heard them before I saw them, voices, low and guttural, coming from deeper in the forest. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't sound right. It was more like a mix of English and something else, something primal. My flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows across the trees as I stumbled over roots and rocks. That's when I saw them, 3 figures moving through the trees, their bodies hunched and twisted. They weren't like any people I'd ever seen, filthy, covered in dirt, their faces obscured by hair and grime. But what stood out most was their size. These weren't just people. They were massive, their limbs elongated and distorted, like something had gone wrong during their growth. Inbred, maybe. Whatever they weren't fully human anymore. They were hunting me. I pushed harder, my lungs burning as I ducked and weaved through the forest. Every step I took they matched, moving faster and faster. I could hear them now, their breath ragged, their laughter, if you could call it that, echoing through the trees. I spotted the truck ahead, the only salvation I had left, but I wasn't fast enough. One of them grabbed me from behind, dragging me to the ground. I kicked and thrashed, but its grip was like iron. I felt a blade press against my neck, cold and sharp. For a second, I thought it was over, that I was just going to end up like the bodies in that basement. But then a gunshot rang out, echoing through the woods. The grip on my neck loosened, and I scrambled to my feet. Another shot followed, and the figure that had me collapsed to the ground, unmoving. I turned to see a man standing by the truck, rifle in hand. He looked like a local, flannel shirt, beard, and a cigarette hanging from his mouth. Without saying a word, he motioned for me to get in. I didn't argue. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the rumble of the engine and my laboured breathing. I didn't ask who he was, and he didn't offer any explanation. After what felt like hours, he finally spoke. "Don't ever come back here. Those woods belong to them now." I didn't ask who they were. I didn't need to. I left Oregon the next morning. Didn't even stop in Eugene. I never told anyone what happened, not my brother, not my friends. But every now and then, I think about that basement, about the bodies and the ones still roaming the forest, and I know one thing for sure. I'm never taking another back road again. People say the Appalachian forests are haunted. I'd heard the rumors, whispers of restless spirits and strange disappearances, but I'd never given them much thought. After years of debunking ghost stories as a journalist, I became the kind of person who trusted facts, not folklore. Still, I couldn't resist the pull of Pisgah National Forest. It was remote, beautiful, and full of forgotten places that no one cared to visit anymore. Perfect for the series I'd been working on for my blog, Ghost Towns of the Forgotten South. This was my passion now, travelling, exploring the lost corners of America, and turning those empty spaces into stories. This time, I was after an old settlement deep in the forest, one that most people in town wouldn't even talk about. There were no records of why it had been abandoned, just strange rumours of sickness and disappearances. But those stories were always embellished over time. People loved their spooky tales, and it was my job to sift the truth from the legend. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the trailhead, not far from the ghost town, or what remained of it. I planned to spend a couple of nights out here, explore, take some pictures, and maybe talk to a few locals who might know more about its history. The air was crisp and cool as I stepped outside. The towering trees cast long shadows, making it feel later than it was. As I set up camp, I noticed how unnaturally quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I brushed it off. Deep forests always had a strange stillness about them. I'd been in enough of them to know that the real danger was tripping over a root, not some ghostly figure hiding behind the trees. That first night, I woke to a distant sound, like laughter. It was faint, barely a whisper on the wind. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. Could there be other campers out here? I doubted it. This part of the forest wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. My phone was dead, but I'd recorded some video earlier in the day. I grabbed my camera and replayed the footage. There it was, faint, like a breeze blowing through, but unmistakable, children's laughter. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to sleep. I had a lot of ground to cover tomorrow, and the last thing I needed was to let my imagination run wild. The next day, I set out to find the old settlement. It was slow going. Thick overgrowth and fading trails made navigation difficult. The map I had was basic, nothing more than a dotted line leading me deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was closing in around me. But I kept going, determined to find this place. After about an hour, I noticed carvings, symbols, strange and jagged, etched into the bark of the trees. They weren't any kind of writing I recognized, but they gave me an uneasy feeling. Maybe it was some old superstition, a way to ward off bad spirits. I took a few photos and kept moving. It was another hour before I finally found it. The ghost town was just as eerie as I'd imagined. Small, dilapidated cabins stood in clusters, some half collapsed under the weight of time and nature. Weeds and vines crept over everything, reclaiming the land. I walked through the empty streets, my camera clicking as I captured the desolation, the eerie stillness. That's when I saw the cemetery. Small, tucked away behind what must have been the church, though the building itself was nothing more than a few rotting beams. The graves were old, the names barely legible, but the dates caught my eye. Some of them were from decades ago, but others were from the future. My first instinct was that it had to be a mistake, some kind of misprint or vandalism, but the stones looked too old, too weathered to be recent. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped back from the graves. It didn't make sense, and I didn't like the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I realized then that I hadn't heard anything. Not birds, not insects, nothing since I'd arrived. I packed up my camera and headed back toward my RV. I'd gotten what I came for and figured I'd do some research on the strange gravestones when I got back to town. But something was wrong. The trail didn't look right. I was sure I'd come from this direction, but now the trees seemed different. The symbols I'd passed earlier weren't there anymore, and the forest seemed denser, more oppressive. My pulse quickened. I was lost. That was impossible. I never got lost. Not with GPS and maps, not with all the preparation I'd done. I kept walking, trying to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every turn led me to unfamiliar territory, and soon the forest looked completely foreign. My sense of time slipped away, and the sky started to darken, even though it felt like midday. Then I saw it, just ahead through the trees. A figure stood on the trail, tall and motionless, watching me. I stopped cold, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, squinting through the gloom, but as I did, it vanished, just gone. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack. This was wrong. Everything was wrong. The sun had nearly set by the time I found my RV. It was parked where I left it, but somehow the journey back had taken hours longer than it should have. My legs were aching, my mind spinning with confusion. I climbed inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing onto the bed. That's when the laughter started again, louder this time, right outside the RV. I shot up, my heart pounding. I could hear them, children laughing and running around, their voices bouncing off the trees. I grabbed the camera, pointing it toward the window. But the moment I did, the laughter stopped. The forest was silent again, suffocating in its stillness. I played back the footage on the camera, hoping to catch something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But instead, I heard something else, a voice, clear as day, whispering my name. "Alex." I froze. The camera dropped from my hands and hit the floor with a thud, the sound echoing in the empty RV. Something was out there, and it knew my name. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed, every muscle tense, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. I thought about leaving, driving out of the forest and abandoning the project altogether. But the RV wouldn't start. I tried the engine a dozen times, but it was dead. Dead as if the battery had drained overnight. My phone was useless, still dead from the day before. I was completely cut off. The next morning I decided I had to do something. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there watching me. I remembered the symbols on the trees, the strange carvings I'd seen on my hike. They had to mean something. Maybe they were the key to getting out of here. I grabbed my camping knife and headed back into the woods. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of dread. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep walking. I found the first symbol carved into the bark of a tree just off the trail. With a deep breath, I drove the blade into the wood, carving through the lines. As soon as the symbol was broken, the air shifted. The forest seemed to shudder, and for a moment I thought I heard a scream, a distant echo and wail carried on the wind. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but I kept going. I found the next tree and did the same, cutting through the strange lines with my knife. The voices grew louder, the laughter, the whispers, all swirling around me like a storm. I could see the figures now, darting between the trees, shadowy, faceless figures watching, waiting. They wanted me to stop. They didn't want me to leave. But I wasn't going to be trapped here. Not like them. I reached the final tree, my hands trembling as I raised the knife. The voices were deafening now, the figures closing in, but I didn't stop. With one last slash I broke the symbol, and just like that the voices stopped. The forest went still. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive weight that had hung over me lifted. I stumbled back toward my RV, half expecting the figures to reappear, but the woods were empty. When I got back, the engine started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove out of the forest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles wide. I wasn't going to write about this place. I wasn't going to tell anyone what happened here. Some things are better left forgotten. I thought a week alone in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest would be the perfect way to clear my head after everything that had happened. The divorce, leaving the military, and that nagging feeling I'd wasted years of my life. I figured some isolation would help me reset, so I packed up my RV, grabbed my gear, and drove deep into the heart of the forest. I should have known better when I first pulled into the campsite. I felt that familiar sense of calm I used to get on deployment, a kind of satisfaction that comes with being prepared for whatever the wilderness might throw at me. The Apache Sitgreaves is a vast, rugged place, and this far in, you don't see many other campers. That's why I picked it. No people, no distractions, just the forest, my RV, and my thoughts. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV at the edge of a tree line overlooking a deep ravine. The view was incredible. The trees spread out like a sea of green, with the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the land. I spent the first day hiking, snapping a few photos of the landscape and trying to relax. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply, but I welcomed the cold. It felt like the world was trying to numb me, erase the pain I'd been carrying since Rachel left. I lit a small fire, sat by it, and let the quiet settle in. That's what I wanted, after all. But the silence felt different out here. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The first night passed uneventfully, but something woke me around 3 a.m. I sat bolt upright, listening. There it was again, a sound just outside the RV. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife or the distant call of an owl. No, this was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps. At first, I thought maybe another camper had wandered into my area, but when I peered through the window, all I saw was blackness, the dense trees illuminated only by the faint moonlight. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, scanning the edges of the trees. The footsteps had stopped. Nothing moved. The fire had long since died out, leaving behind only a few glowing embers. No signs of anyone. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But even as I lay back down, the hairs on the back of my neck stayed up, like I wasn't alone. By the second day, I was already starting to feel the isolation. The weather was turning colder than I'd expected, and to make matters worse, the RV's heater was acting up. It kept cutting out, leaving the inside freezing. At night, I spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong, but it was no use. I'd have to tough it out. I hiked out again that afternoon, looking for some distraction. The forest was beautiful, but in an unforgiving way. The trails were rough, and after a while I veered off the main path looking for more secluded spots to explore. I told myself it was for the photography, but really, I just wanted to be somewhere no one could find me. That's when I first saw the carvings. At first, I didn't even notice them. They were subtle, old, just faint marks on the trees. I stopped to take a break and caught sight of one right in front of me. A series of lines etched into the bark, almost like a symbol. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grooves. It wasn't natural. Someone or something had put it there. As I moved on, I found more of them, scattered and in no particular pattern, but close enough to make me uneasy. They circled the area where I'd set up camp like some kind of boundary. I shook off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. This forest was old. People had been here long before me, carving symbols and marks for reasons long forgotten. Nothing to worry about. But I didn't stop worrying. That night, I woke up again. The same time as before, 3 a.m. The footsteps were back, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, soft but deliberate, like someone walking slowly around the RV, testing the ground with each step. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the RV, paused, then resumed. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight, but hesitated. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something else? The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then I heard the tapping. Soft, rhythmic taps on the windows. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The taps grew louder, more insistent, coming from all sides of the RV now. I forced myself to get up slowly and crept to the nearest window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain back just a little. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness outside. Nothing, just the forest and the shadows. But when I looked again, I saw it. A handprint pressed against the glass, smudged and distorted like someone or something had leaned in close. The print was too large to be human. Its fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the palm had an odd, warped shape to it. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I stood there frozen, but the tapping eventually stopped. The air felt thick, like it was pushing down on me, suffocating me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my hunting knife, waiting for the footsteps to return. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I packed my gear and decided to head out early. Whatever had been out there the night before, I didn't want to find out. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. Dead. The frustration boiled over into panic. I was stranded. I grabbed my map and decided I'd have to hike out to the nearest ranger station, a few miles away. It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't stay here another night, not with whatever was out there. I set off down the trail, moving fast. The cold had seeped into my bones, but I pushed on, hoping to make it before dark. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow hiding something just out of sight, and the feeling of being watched, it never went away. About halfway to the station, I heard it again, footsteps that weren't my own. I stopped, listening. My hand rested on the knife at my side. Then I heard a voice. It came from behind me, soft and distant. Liam. I froze. My blood ran cold. Liam, help me. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Rachel's voice, my ex-wife, but she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Liam. Her voice again, closer this time. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. The voice followed me, calling my name over and over. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, trying to focus on the trail. But then I saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, not 20 feet ahead. The figure was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were long and thin, draped in tattered rags that seemed to shift in the wind. Its face? There was no face. Just a void, a swirling mass of darkness where its features should have been. Its eyes, though, its eyes were glowing, bright yellow, like two embers burning in the night. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I fumbled for my knife, holding it out in front of me, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no sense to it. This thing wasn't human. It wasn't natural. The Watcher. Something from old Apache legends, stories I'd heard long ago, was real, and it had found me. The thing took a step forward, and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I don't remember much of the run. It was a blur of trees and shadows, the forest closing in on me as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. The Watcher's eyes burned into my back. Somehow I made it to the ranger station. I don't know how, but when I stumbled into the clearing and saw the small building, I nearly collapsed in relief. I burst through the door, breathless and shaking. The ranger inside looked up, startled, but I couldn't form the words to explain what had happened. I didn't need to. When I finally caught my breath, I told him everything. The footsteps, the handprints, the thing in the forest. He didn't believe me, of course. Why would he? He checked my RV later, saw the scratches and the smudged handprint, but still shrugged it off. Probably just a bear, he said. But I know better. As I sit here now, writing this down, I can still feel it. The Watcher's eyes on me. It's waiting, watching, and it'll follow me no matter where I go. Some things you can't outrun. I've always believed that everything has an explanation. Ghost stories, strange occurrences. They're all just misinterpretations of reality. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV deep into the desert, chasing the Marfa lights, one of those unexplained phenomena that people love to whisper about. I was determined to demystify them, capture them on camera, and show the world that there was nothing supernatural about it. The desert stretched out before me, flat and endless, the sky a deep, cloudless blue. I'd parked my RV on the outskirts of Marfa, Texas, far enough from the town to avoid any distractions. The lights were supposed to appear at night, floating out there in the desert like glowing orbs. People called them spirits or even UFOs, but I knew better. I was here to photograph them, document them, and move on. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I set up my camera gear just outside the RV, tripods locked in place, lenses ready for long exposure shots. The desert was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you've been buried under a blanket. No wind, no animals, not even the hum of distant cars. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I'd been alone in the wild before. This was nothing new. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up and call it a night, the lights appeared. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable, small glowing orbs that hovered just above the horizon. I leaned forward in my chair, eyes fixed on them. They weren't anything special, just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, I thought. But then they moved slowly, almost deliberately. They floated closer, their soft glow reflecting off the desert sand. I snapped photo after photo, my fingers flying over the camera buttons. This was exactly what I'd come for. Clear, undeniable evidence. No one could call this supernatural nonsense once I had the data. But the lights were behaving differently than I expected. They weren't just floating randomly. They were almost watching me. I stood up, staring at the lights as they hovered, flickering softly, maybe 50 yards away. Then suddenly, they darted closer. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped back instinctively. The lights pulsed, brightening for a moment before retreating, as if they were playing with me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Just lights, just gases or atmospheric anomalies, nothing to be afraid of. But the way they moved, it was like they were alive. I shook my head, frustrated. "Focus, Greg, it's all explainable," I muttered to myself. I turned back to my camera gear, checking the shots I'd taken. That's when the first problem started. The images were completely corrupted. Every shot I'd taken of the lights was ruined, nothing but distorted lines and static, like an old TV losing signal. I flipped through the photos in disbelief. The lights had been right there, clear as day, but my camera had failed to capture a single usable image. My stomach churned. That wasn't right. I'd tested all the equipment before I left. I'd checked the camera, adjusted the settings, but the battery was draining fast, too fast. The indicator flashed red, and within seconds the camera died in my hands. "Damn it," I hissed, grabbing my backup battery, but it was no use. Everything, camera, spare batteries, even my phone, was losing power faster than it should. It was like something was draining the life out of my equipment. Frustrated, I packed up my gear and headed back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried not to think about the lights still hovering outside, flickering just beyond the window. It had to be a glitch, I told myself. I'd deal with it in the morning. But I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in around me. Every so often, I'd glance at the window, expecting to see the lights hovering there. I didn't want to admit it, but something about them unnerved me. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease. I spent hours checking my gear, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but everything looked fine. The equipment was fully functional again, as if nothing had happened. It was strange, but I wasn't about to let one weird night stop me. I'd try again tonight, capture the lights properly this time. As evening fell, I set up my gear again, determined to make up for last night. The desert was still, the sky a dull orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. I watched, waiting for the lights to appear, and they did. But this time, they were closer. They floated just above the sand, pulsing softly, glowing brighter than before. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them move. Their rhythm was almost hypnotic. But it wasn't just their movement that startled me. It was the fact that they seemed to be getting nearer. I reached for my camera, ready to capture them again, but the battery was dead. Again. I checked my phone. Dead. Panic flickered at the edge of my mind. This wasn't possible. The lights were now just 30 feet away, their glow casting long shadows on the ground. They pulsed brighter, flickering in strange, almost deliberate patterns. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were trying to communicate. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the wind brushing past my ear. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer. "Greg," my blood ran cold. I whipped around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one, just the empty desert. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Greg." I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't explainable. The lights were hovering just a few feet away now, and the whispers, they were inside my head. I scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. The lights were outside the window, pulsing, flickering. The whispering continued, filling the small space with eerie, disembodied voices. I tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power, no escape. The lights pressed closer, their glow filling the RV, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt them, those whispers crawling into my mind, telling me to come outside, to follow them into the desert. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I wasn't going to let this beat me. I wasn't going to give in to fear. But then the lights began to move. They circled the RV faster and faster, like they were closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Follow the lights. I felt a tug, a pull in my chest, as if the lights were calling me, drawing me out of the RV. I fought against it, but it was getting harder to resist. The lights flickered faster, the whispers filling my head until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my jacket and kicked the door open, running into the desert. The lights followed, darting around me, leading me deeper into the night. I stumbled through the sand, my heart pounding. The whispers guided me further from the RV, but something inside me snapped. I stopped running, gasping for air, and turned to face the lights. I wasn't going to follow them. I wasn't going to disappear like so many before me. No, I shouted, my voice trembling. I won't go. The lights pulsed, flickering faster. The whispers screamed in my head, but I stood my ground, forcing myself to ignore them. Slowly, the lights began to fade. The whispers grew softer, until they were nothing more than faint echoes in the wind. I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted, my mind spinning. The lights were gone, retreating into the desert, but I knew they'd be back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, I packed up and left Marfa. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the desert, far from the lights. I never told anyone what happened. No one would believe me anyway. But I'll never forget those lights, the way they moved, the way they whispered my name. I came here to prove they were just a natural phenomenon, just an unexplained mystery of the desert. But now I know better. Some things aren't meant to be explained, and some lights should never be followed. I came to Red River Gorge to find peace, or at least that's what I told myself. When you've lost everything, when your life's fallen apart, nature feels like the only refuge. The solitude, the silence, they're supposed to help you clear your mind, right? But if I'd known what waited for me in those woods, I might have stayed home. I parked my old Jeep at the trailhead, strapped on my pack, and set off. The first day was perfect. The crisp autumn air had the faint smell of wet leaves, and the colours, God, the colours were dazzling. I'm a photographer by trade now, trying to make a name for myself since leaving teaching. The leaves, in their fiery oranges and deep reds, made the perfect backdrop for my shots. It was the kind of beauty you could get lost in. I guess that's what I was hoping for. The trail was tough, though, harder than I expected. The steep climbs had my legs burning, and my pack felt heavier with every step. I could feel the camera bouncing against my back, reminding me why I was here. The plan was simple, a week alone in the wilderness, just me, my gear, and enough food to get by. No distractions, no people, no Rachel. I shook the thought out of my head and kept walking, focusing on the landscape instead. The river was nearby, its faint gurgle a common soundtrack to the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time the sun started to dip, I was more exhausted than I should have been. My muscles ached from the unfamiliar terrain, and blisters had already formed on my heels. I set up camp by the river. I'd brought an old tent that had seen better days, but I figured it would hold up fine for a week. The stove, a clearance sale special, was already giving me trouble. The flame flickered weakly, as if unsure of itself, and I ended up eating half-cooked noodles before giving up and settling into my sleeping bag. That first night I didn't sleep well. At first it was just the usual branches rustling, the wind whispering through the leaves, but around midnight I heard something strange. It sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. I sat up, listening. It came again, too soft to make out words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence like speech. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe distant campers, but there had been no cars at the trailhead. I was alone out here. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was harder. The trail was steep, and my legs were sore from the day before. The scenery was still breathtaking, but the deeper I went into the gorge, the more oppressive it felt. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out the sun, casting long shadows that made the woods seem darker than they should have been. It was around midday when I first saw it. I was setting up a shot of a rocky outcrop, the kind of thing that might make a good feature for my portfolio, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was that primal sensation, the one that tells you you're not alone. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was, just within the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall and thin, wearing a long tattered coat, but something was off. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. "You're just seeing things," I muttered to myself. "It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were garbled, like someone trying to speak underwater. I lay in my tent, wide-eyed and tense, listening. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to swirl around the camp, circling me. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped open the tent, and shined the beam into the woods. There was nothing, just the trees, the river, the empty night. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. I was too scared to make a sound, as if acknowledging it would make it real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap. My breath came in sharp, visible puffs as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw the footprints. They were large, human-shaped and fresh, pressed into the damp earth around my tent. They hadn't been there before I went to bed. My heart raced as I knelt down to examine them. They circled my campsite as though someone or something had been watching me, walking around while I slept. Panic bubbled up in my chest. I backed away slowly, stumbling as I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it up as fast as I could. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers continued, relentless until dawn. By the third day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, and every step felt like agony. My legs were leaden, my pack seemed twice as heavy, and my mind was unraveling. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart into overdrive. I wanted to leave, but I was too far in now. It would take me days to hike back out, and the thought of turning around filled me with a strange sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the gorge itself didn't want me to leave, like it was holding me here, drawing me deeper into its clutches. I kept walking, pushing through the exhaustion, trying to ignore the whispers that still echoed in my head. By midday, I found myself near the river again, at a small clearing. I decided to stop and rest, hoping the sight of the water might calm me. But as I sat there, staring at the rippling current, I saw something across the riverbank. The figure. It was standing on the opposite shore, half hidden by the trees. I could see it more clearly now. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It wore tattered, greyish rags that fluttered in the breeze. But its face was a blur, a smudge of darkness that seemed to shift and warp as I stared at it. My pulse quickened and my breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I raised the lens, focused on the figure, and snapped the shutter. The moment I did, the figure flickered like static on an old TV. 1 second it was there, and the next, it wasn't, gone. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of here, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. They filled the air around me, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other, too fast to understand. And then I felt it. A cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder, like fingers pressing into my skin. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and backing away from the riverbank. The coldness followed me, clinging to me like invisible hands, trying to pull me down. I ran blindly, recklessly, away from the water, away from the voices. I didn't stop until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the cold lingered, sinking deep into my bones. I was shaking, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat by my dying campfire, clutching my camera, my eyes darting nervously around the darkened woods. The whispers had returned, but they were softer now, distant. I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, the wraith as I'd come to call it, was out there, watching me, waiting for me. I tried to rationalize it, but there was no denying the truth anymore. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't a trick of the light or the wind playing games with my mind. There was something in these woods, something ancient, something angry. On the 5th day, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking with nervous energy. I didn't care how long it took. I had to get out of this place. But the gorge had other plans. As I made my way back toward the trailhead, the path seemed to shift beneath my feet. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way out. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, the same trees, the same stretch of river. It was like the forest was folding in on itself, trapping me in a maze of endless woods. And then I saw it again, the wraith. It stood in the distance, half hidden by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I raised my camera again, my only weapon, and snapped the shutter. The wraith flickered, its form distorting, but it didn't disappear. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its tattered clothes trailing behind it like smoke. The whispers grew louder, the air around me colder, thicker. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. The wraith didn't stop. It came closer and closer until it stood just feet away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Its face, a swirling mass of darkness, hovered inches from mine. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke, "You can't leave." When I woke up, I was lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. The wraith was gone, but the memory of its voice lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade. I don't know how I made it back to the trailhead. I don't remember the walk, the drive, or even packing up my gear. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back to Red River Gorge. Some places weren't meant to be explored. I should have known better than to trust an unmarked road. After years of travel writing, you'd think I'd have a sharper instinct for bad decisions. But there I was, driving deeper into Fort Pinchot National Forest, chasing a forgotten trail that was supposed to lead me to a ghost town no one could find anymore. Vanished off the map. The ranger at the visitor center had said with a grin, "People go looking for it and never see it again. It's like the road just swallows you up." He laughed, but I could see the glint in his eye. He loved spinning those kinds of tales for tourists, but I wasn't a tourist. I was a writer. Damn it, I had an assignment to finish, and there was no room for ghost stories. I followed the narrow, crumbling logging road as it wound deeper into the trees. My RV rattled along, tires crunching over fallen branches and loose gravel. The road narrowed, barely wide enough for my rig, but I kept going. I'd done my research, and this was the right way, even if the forest seemed determined to reclaim the path. It had been a long day, and I was eager to set up camp and relax before exploring the area the next morning. The further I went, the thicker the trees grew, their branches knitting together overhead, blotting out the late afternoon sun. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I didn't need it. I was prepared. I had maps. I was confident I didn't get lost easily. But as I rounded the last bend in the road, something changed. The sky had been clear earlier, but a dense fog was rolling in now, thick and fast. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. The road, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to dissolve into a grey blur. I slowed to a crawl, squinting through the windshield. Just up ahead, a small clearing appeared through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough room for me to park the RV. I didn't have many other options. I pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped outside. The fog clung to everything, making the air feel damp and cold. It shouldn't have been this cold, not in early fall. The chill crept into my bones, but I pushed it aside and started setting up camp. Something about the silence gnawed at me, though. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness in that damned fog. I finished my setup quickly, then retreated to the warmth of the RV. I wasn't nervous, but the quiet was getting under my skin. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, settled into the driver's seat and pulled out my maps. I spread them across the dash, looking for my next move. The ghost town was supposed to be less than a mile away, hidden deep in the woods, down a trail that was barely marked. Tomorrow I'd hike to it, get my pictures, take some notes, and be done with it. Easy. But something was off. The road I'd driven on wasn't showing up on the map anymore. I traced the route with my finger, confused. The road was here. I'd just come down it, but now on the map it wasn't anywhere to be found. I leaned back in my seat, staring out the windshield at the fog-shrouded forest. The ranger's words echoed in my mind, vanished off the map. I laughed softly to myself. It was a joke, a tall tale to scare off amateur hikers. Nothing more. Still, when I stepped outside to stretch my legs, I felt it again, that unsettling stillness. The fog was thicker now, curling around the RV like tendrils. I looked back toward the road I'd driven in on, but it wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes and stepped forward, peering into the mist. No road, just an unbroken line of trees. My stomach tightened. I walked a few more steps, hoping the road would reappear, but it didn't. The forest was dense, the trees close together. There was no sign of the path I had taken just hours earlier. It was as if it had been swallowed whole. I jogged back to the RV, heart racing now. I grabbed my flashlight and marched back to where the road should have been, sweeping the beam through the fog, but all I could see were trees, tall, dark, and oppressive. My breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood there, trying to make sense of it. The road couldn't just vanish. I hadn't gotten lost. I couldn't have. But when I turned back toward the RV, I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I swung the flashlight around, heart pounding, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the fog. A figure tall and thin slipping between the trees. "Hello?" My voice cracked. I regretted speaking as soon as the word left my mouth. The fog swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. I backed toward the RV, my nerves on edge, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't about to let a little fog and a missing road freak me out, but something felt wrong. The rational part of my brain was trying to make sense of it. Fog could play tricks on your eyes, and maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere. That was all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next hour pacing the length of the RV, checking and rechecking my maps, trying to retrace my route in my head. Nothing made sense. The road had been there. I hadn't imagined it. By nightfall, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The temperature had dropped even more, and I cranked up the RV's heater, wrapping myself in blankets. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, soft thuds, like footsteps outside, and whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. It had to be the fog, I told myself. It was distorting sound, making me paranoid. But when I woke in the middle of the night, there were voices. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear them, faint, murmuring voices coming from outside. I crawled to the front of the RV, heart hammering, and peered through the windshield. The figures were back. This time there were more of them. Shadows in the fog, standing still, watching. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. I scrambled to turn on the engine, but it sputtered and died. No power. The RV was silent, cold, and dark. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I tried to stay calm, tried to think logically, but my heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic. The road was gone, the figures were back, and now I was trapped here. I had to get out. I grabbed my jacket and burst out of the RV. The cold hit me like a slab. I marched toward where the road had been, determined to find it, but the forest had shifted. The trees were closer now, the fog denser. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape stayed the same. It was as if I was walking in circles. No matter which way I turned, I kept ending up back at the RV. I could hear the voices again, closer now. They echoed through the fog, indistinct and ghostly. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the beam of light. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me, my chest heaving. The figures were out there, circling me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The fog pressed against the windows and the shadows loomed outside, never coming closer, but never leaving. Morning came, though I could barely tell. The fog hadn't lifted, and the road was still gone. I tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I turned the RV around, driving slowly back the way I'd come. If the road was there, I couldn't see it. All I could do was follow the same path I'd taken before, hoping it would lead me out. But it didn't. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, a straight line through the fog leading nowhere. And as I drove, I realized with sinking dread that I was still trapped. The road hadn't taken me anywhere. I was driving in circles and the figures were still there, watching, waiting. They had me now. The vanishing road wasn't just a story. It was real and I wasn't getting out. I bought the trailer last spring second-hand from a guy who was moving to Florida. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. That trailer was supposed to be my sanctuary. After the stress of the divorce and losing my job, I needed a break from everything. The thought of spending a few nights by myself, parked somewhere quiet, far from the chaos of my life, sounded like exactly what I needed. So, I headed to a place that had been calling to me ever since I'd heard about it, Lake Lanier. People talked about the lake in hushed tones around the campfire when I was younger. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed that entire towns had been drowned when they flooded the valley to create the lake in the 50s, cemeteries included. The dead, they said, were still down there, restless, under the water. I never paid much attention to the stories. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But after everything I'd been through lately, the idea of driving to the lake and parking my trailer on a secluded shore was more appealing than ever. A fresh start, even if just for a few days. I found a spot at the edge of a small, isolated cove, far from any of the designated campgrounds or busy boat ramps. Just the quiet lap of water against the shore and the trees standing tall and silent. It was perfect. Peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I parked the trailer and set up camp, watching as the late afternoon sun shimmered on the surface of the lake. That first evening, I cracked open a beer and settled into my lawn chair facing the water. The silence was deep and soothing, almost too quiet. I could barely hear the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, birds singing, frogs croaking, just the faintest trickle of the water lapping against the shore. At first it was comforting. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. But then, as dusk fell, the air started to feel heavy, as if something unseen had slipped into the space around me. I ignored it. Just nerves, I thought. I was stressed, burned out, and needed to relax. But even as the sun slipped below the horizon and the lake turned dark and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the first night, I heard the sound, a soft splash, like someone wading through the shallows right outside my trailer. It was nearly midnight, and the fire had long since died out. I was tucked inside the trailer, half asleep, when I heard it again. Splash, then silence. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Probably a fish, I told myself, or some animal come down for a drink. But it wasn't. The splash came again, and this time it was louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking through the water slowly. I crept to the window and peeked out, my breath catching in my throat. The moon was bright enough to light the water, and for a second I swore I saw a shape, something dark, standing in the shallows just a few feet from shore. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, like a person, but the figure was strange. Its head was too low, like it was hunched over, and its limbs looked wrong. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I stood frozen, heart racing, as I stared out at the still water. Nothing, just the calm surface of the lake, as if nothing had been there at all. I didn't sleep much after that, tossing and turning, convinced it was just my imagination. I'd been through a lot lately. It was bound to mess with my head. The next morning I tried to shake off the unease. I spent the day fishing. Even though I didn't catch much, I kept telling myself I was just tired, that the isolation was getting to me. But then, when I walked back to the trailer in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. Footprints, small barefoot prints in the mud, leading from the water's edge up toward my trailer. They were small, like a child's. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were my own tracks from earlier, but I hadn't been barefoot, and they didn't look right. They crisscrossed each other, as if someone had wandered back and forth around and around before disappearing into the trees. I crouched down, running my fingers over the prints, a chill creeping up my spine. There was no one else out here, no one but me. I looked up at the lake, at the still, murky water. It seemed darker than before, as if the light couldn't quite reach beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light. Maybe an animal had left the prints, or maybe someone else had camped here before I arrived. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. I had just turned off the lights and settled into bed when I heard it, the soft, wet squelch of footsteps moving slowly around the trailer. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight and the small hunting knife I had brought with me, inching toward the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I flicked on the light and threw open the door, shining the beam of the flashlight out into the night. Nothing, just the trees, the water, and the faint rustle of wind. But I knew I'd heard it. I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard footsteps circling the trailer, bare footsteps like someone creeping through the mud. I locked the door and stayed up for hours listening, but there was nothing else that night, just silence. By the next morning, my nerves were shot. I drove into town to grab supplies and shake off the tension. While waiting at a local diner for my food, I overheard some locals talking about the lake, about the old towns that had been submerged when the dam was built, and about the cemeteries that hadn't been fully relocated before the waters rose. "The dead don't rest easy out there," one of the older men said, his voice low. "You spend too much time by the lake at night, and you'll start hearing them. You'll hear them call your name, luring you down to the water." I felt the cold sweat trickle down my back. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, never had. But the way the man spoke, as if he'd seen something, felt something, unnerved me. I left the diner and drove back to the lake, more on edge than before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the dread returned. It was stronger now, more insistent, like something in the air had shifted. I sat by the fire, staring at the lake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The water, dark and still, seemed to be hiding something beneath its surface, and then I heard it. A voice, faint, almost indistinguishable from the breeze, but there, whispering my name. Rick. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared out at the water, the fire crackling behind me, and the voice came again, soft and distant. Rick. It wasn't just the wind, it was real. I stood up, backing away from the shore, my pulse racing. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the water, my hands trembling. That's when I saw them. Figures, dark, pale shapes just below the surface of the water. They were small, human-shaped, but their faces were twisted and distorted, like they were drowning but frozen in place. The water around them rippled slightly, as if they were trying to reach for me, but they stayed submerged, watching. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the figures, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. I was losing it. I had to be. I turned and bolted back to the trailer, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife I'd grabbed. The footsteps came again that night, louder, more insistent, and the voice kept calling my name. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how irrational it seemed or how crazy the story would sound when I got back home. I wasn't staying another night by that cursed lake. I packed up the trailer and tried to start the truck, dead. The battery was completely drained, even though I hadn't left anything running overnight. My hands shook as I tried again, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the vehicle. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I tried to think. I could hike back to town, but it would take hours, and the thought of leaving the trailer and whatever safety it offered seemed like a death sentence. The water called to me, louder now. The whispers coming more frequently. They wanted me in the lake. I grabbed a set of tools from the back of the trailer, hoping to get the engine working again. As I worked, I felt eyes on me. I could sense them, the figures standing just at the water's edge, waiting. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick and cold, as I frantically tried to get the battery to respond. Finally, after what felt like hours, the engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I jumped into the truck, threw it into gear, and peeled out of the campsite, the trailer jerking behind me. As I drove away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the lake, their pale, distorted faces watching me as I sped off into the night. I never went back to Lake Lanier. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what happened, but even now, months later, when I lie awake at night in my own bed far from the lake, I can still hear it. The faint sound of whispers calling my name. The darkness of the Wa National Forest stretched before me like an endless abyss. The trees, as ancient as the land itself, rose tall and imposing, blocking any light that might escape from the stars. This was the kind of place I used to love, complete isolation, pure, untouched nature. I was there to study the behavior of some rare owl species and take a few nighttime photographs. At least, that was the plan. At first, everything was as expected. I'd parked my trailer in a remote part of the forest, far from tourist trails and campgrounds. The silence that surrounded the area was reassuring. I was used to this kind of environment, and loved the challenge of being completely alone, immersed in nature. But that night, the silence felt different, thick, heavy. I finished setting up camp and prepared for a night of observation. The wind blew gently, and the leaves made that soft, soothing sound that always accompanied the beginning of a night in the forest. For some reason, though, I felt a slight sense of unease, as if something was watching me. I ignored it. I knew solitude could play tricks on the mind. I had always been a skeptic. I wasn't the type to fall for superstitions or local legends. I went into the trailer to adjust my equipment. I wanted to set up the cameras and recorders to capture sounds and images of the animals that, with luck, would appear around me. But the first sign that something was wrong came then. My cameras started malfunctioning. The display kept flickering, and the images came out distorted, as if something was interfering with the sensors. I looked at the cameras, confused. They were charged, working perfectly before I left home. I tried again, but the problem persisted. I thought it might be magnetic interference, some kind of atmospheric anomaly that could happen in more remote areas. I decided to step outside and check my phone's GPS, but to my surprise it had no signal. Okay, I thought. It's not the end of the world. I'm in a remote area. It might just be a matter of finding a higher spot to get a signal. But as the night went on, things really started to get strange. I was outside adjusting the camera lens when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural noise echoing between the trees. It was hard to tell what it was, something deep in the forest. It sounded distant, but it was enough to put me on alert. I knew all kinds of wild animal sounds, but this wasn't familiar. I swept the darkness with my flashlight, trying to locate the source of the sound, but all I saw was the faint glow of trees and the light reflecting off the leaves. The wind seemed to have stopped suddenly, leaving the forest completely still. There wasn't even the sound of insects or owls. Absolute silence. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. I knew that sometimes nature could be like this. Predators could silence the environment, scaring off smaller animals. But even by predator standards, that silence was oppressive. I decided to head back to the trailer and wait until morning. Maybe it was just exhaustion talking, and the darkness made everything scarier than it really was. After all, I'd spent the whole day exploring the place. I lay down on my bunk, trying to relax, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake it. Then I heard the sounds again, footsteps. I knew the sound of animal footsteps well, but these were different, heavy, long, with a deliberate drag. I got up slowly, my senses on high alert. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the door. Something was moving outside. With my heart racing, I carefully opened the trailer door, and the flashlight illuminated the ground around me. Claw marks. The ground was scratched, as if something large had passed through. I stood still for a moment, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It could have been a bear or a wolf, but the marks were deep, as if made by something strong enough to tear the bark off a tree with a single swipe. A slight pressure began building in my chest. I wasn't easily scared, but what was happening here was strange, very strange. The next day, I drove to the nearest town. I needed fuel for the generator, and I also wanted to ask a local if they had seen any signs of bears or wolves in that part of the forest. I walked into a small grocery store and casually mentioned to the owner, an elderly man, about the marks and the strange silence from the night before. He suddenly grew serious. His dark eyes stared at me, and he said in a grave voice, "That's not a bear, son. That's the shadow of the Black Forest." Confused, I asked what he meant by that, and with a worried expression, he told the story of an ancient entity that wandered the forest on nights with a new moon. They say it feeds on travelers' fear, plays with them until it drags them into the darkness. No one who meets it comes back the same. He spoke of the shadow as something that couldn't be defeated, only avoided. I smiled a little, unnerved, thanked him, and returned to the trailer. Small-town superstitions, I thought. Maybe he just wanted to scare me, or perhaps he was exaggerating local legends. But deep down, something inside me felt uneasy. I decided to stay alert, but still rational. That night, the tension grew. The malfunctions with my equipment continued. The trailer's lights began flickering. The generator kept failing. And then I saw them, shadows moving between the trees, fast, but impossible to make out clearly. Something was out there. I stood up and walked to the window, flashlight pointed into the darkness, and that's when I saw it for the first time. The shadow. It was a tall, misshapen figure, almost humanoid, but its arms were long and grotesque, and its eyes glowed with a pale yellow light. It stood about 30 yards away, motionless, between the trees. I felt my blood turn to ice. It was completely still, watching me. The silence returned, heavier than ever. I froze, unable to move for a few seconds. When I blinked, it was gone. My rational mind began to crumble. This couldn't be real. I must have been tired. My mind was probably creating these things, but at the same time, my body knew something dangerous was out there, something I couldn't explain. The following hours were a blur of frustrated attempts to fix the situation. I tried restarting the trailer, adjusting the systems, but everything failed. The light flickered and went out. The wind, which had been still earlier, began to blow fiercely. But instead of easing the tension, the wind carried whispers, distant voices as if the forest itself were trying to tell me something. But I couldn't understand. The shadow appeared again. This time, closer. Its eyes watching me from the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was getting closer, slowly, playing with me. Panic rose in my throat. It was surrounding me, feeding off my fear, just as the old man at the store had said. I tried to leave. I started the trailer's engine, but it died almost instantly. I had no choice but to face this thing. I grabbed an improvised torch and stepped outside, my hands trembling. I had no idea what to do, but I knew I had to try something. The shadow moved again, floating between the trees. My eyes couldn't focus on it for long, but I knew it was getting closer. It was as if it was wrapping me in its darkness, draining my sanity bit by bit. Then I remembered. The fear. It fed on fear. I needed to control it. I had to force my mind to work. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tried to calm my breathing. The panic began to fade, slowly but surely. I opened my eyes, and it was there, standing just a few feet away. But something had changed. It stopped. My controlled breathing, my slowing heartbeat, seemed to weaken it. The glow in its yellow eyes dimmed. I didn't know how, but it seemed to be working. With one last desperate attempt, I got back into the trailer and started the engine. It sputtered, choked, but then roared back to life. I hit the gas, the sound of the engine drowning out the whispers and the wind. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shadow slowly fading into the darkness. I left the forest that night without looking back. I didn't know what that thing was or how I had escaped, but I knew one thing. I would never return to that forest. The shadow of the Black Forest was real, and I was glad to still be alive to tell the tale. My name is Terry Mason, and back in 2018, I took my RV up to Glacier National Park in Montana. I've always been a sucker for the great outdoors. There's something about the crisp mountain air that makes you forget about emails and traffic jams. I arrived at the park on a Tuesday afternoon, eager to set up camp before sunset. The place was breathtaking. Towering peaks capped with snow, pristine lakes reflecting the sky, and dense forests that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. I found a spot near Lake McDonald, not too close to other campers, but within a reasonable distance in case I needed a cup of sugar or someone to share a campfire story with. As I was setting up, a fellow camper wandered over. He was a tall, lanky guy with a beard that would make a lumberjack jealous. "Hey there, name's Bill," he said, extending a hand. "Terry," I replied, shaking it firmly. "First time up here?" "Nah, I've been coming here for years. Best fishing spot this side of the Mississippi," he said with a grin. We chatted for a bit about the usual: weather, the best trails to hike, and the ever-present possibility of bears rummaging through your food stash. "Just remember," Bill said, "the only thing more unpredictable than the wildlife up here is the weather. Keep an eye on the sky." "Will do," I assured him. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I cooked up some dinner. Nothing fancy, just beans and franks. Gourmet cooking was never my strong suit, but hey, everything tastes better when you're camping. I settled into a folding chair, watching the stars prick through the twilight. It was one of those nights where the sky looked like a spilled jar of glitter. I was just about to turn in when I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Probably a raccoon or some other critter looking for scraps, I thought. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence. Great. "Now I'm talking to squirrels," I muttered. I decided to ignore it and headed inside the RV. Just as I was locking up, I heard footsteps, definitely human footsteps, crunching on the gravel outside. I peered through the window but saw nothing. Maybe it was Bill playing a prank. I made a mental note to get back at him with a whoopee cushion under his sleeping bag. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to hit one of the trails Bill had recommended. As I was packing my backpack, I noticed something odd, a small carved wooden figure placed on the hood of my RV. It was crudely made, resembling a human, but with exaggerated features, a long nose and hollow eyes. "Very funny, Bill," I said under my breath. I picked it up and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. Shrugging it off, I tossed the figure into my backpack, thinking it might make for a good souvenir. I set out on the trail, the morning air cool and invigorating. The path wound through thick forests and opened up to stunning vistas of valleys below. About an hour in, I came across a clearing where I saw another camper, a woman this time, looking somewhat lost. "Hey there, you okay?" I called out. She turned abruptly, her face pale. Did you see anyone else around here?" she asked nervously. "Just you and the trees," I replied. "Why? I thought I was being followed," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Probably just the wind playing tricks," I offered. She didn't look convinced. "Maybe. I'm Karen, by the way." "Terry, nice to meet you." We chatted for a bit, and I offered to walk with her until our paths diverged. Safety in numbers, right? As we walked, I tried to lighten the mood. "You know, if we get lost out here, at least we'll have a great story to tell, provided we make it back," I joked. She cracked a smile. "Yeah, and if we don't, we at least make the evening news. Local campers vanish in the woods. Film at 11, I quipped. We parted ways after a while, and I continued deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, and the canopy above thickened, allowing only slivers of sunlight to pierce through. I checked my map and compass to make sure I was still on the right path. That's when I heard it, a faint humming sound, almost like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the sound. I moved cautiously, the humming growing louder as I approached a hidden clearing. Peering through the bushes, I saw a small group of people dressed in tattered clothes gathered around a fire. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, each holding a wooden figure similar to the one I found. Well, this just got interesting, I thought. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but as I zoomed in, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the circle was a body, motionless and covered in what looked like symbols drawn in red. This isn't a knitting club, I whispered to myself as I tried to back away slowly. I stepped on a dry branch, the snap echoing like a gunshot. The chanting stopped abruptly. "Who's there?" a deep voice demanded. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and bolted back the way I came. Behind me I could hear footsteps and shouting. "Get him!" someone yelled. My heart pounded in my chest as I weaved through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I didn't dare look back. I could hear them gaining on me, their footsteps crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I spotted a fallen log ahead and had a split-second decision to make. I leaped over it, hoping they'd trip if they followed too closely. Luck was on my side. I heard a thud and a curse as at least one of them hit the ground. Should have tied your shoelaces, I thought grimly. I kept running until I burst out onto a familiar trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the path back to the campsite, but my relief was short-lived. Standing on the trail ahead was Bill. "Bill, we have to get out of here," I shouted. He looked at me with an odd expression. "Why the rush, Terry?" "There's a group of people back there doing some kind of ritual. I think they killed someone." He tilted his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Oh, you weren't supposed to see that." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "You city folks never learn," he said, taking a step toward me. "Some things are better left alone." I took a step back. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm just going to leave." "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," he replied, pulling out a hunting knife. "Is that supposed to scare me?" I blurted out, my mouth moving faster than my brain. He chuckled. "Always appreciate a bit of humor before the hunt." I turned and ran. Down a side path, adrenaline fueling my legs, I ran. Behind me, Bill's footsteps were steady, unhurried. "You're only making this harder on yourself," he called out. I spotted Karen up ahead, frantically waving at me. "This way," she shouted. I didn't question it. I sprinted toward her and we ducked behind a cluster of boulders. "What's going on?" I gasped. "I saw them too," she whispered. "They've been tracking campers and hikers, picking us off one by one." "Fantastic! And here I thought mosquitoes were the worst thing out here," I said. She gave a grim smile. "We need to get to the ranger station." "Agreed. Any idea which way that is?" "About 2 miles east, but we'll have to go off-trail." "Lead the way." We moved quickly but cautiously, trying to stay hidden. The forest seemed more menacing now, every shadow a potential threat. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged near a dirt road. "Almost there," Karen said. Suddenly, a truck roared up, cutting us off. 2 men jumped out, both holding rifles. "End of the line," one of them sneered. I raised my hands. "Look, we don't want any trouble." "Funny, neither do we," the other man said, cocking his rifle. Karen glanced at me, her eyes conveying a mix of fear and determination. "Got any more of those jokes?" she whispered. "Why did the chicken cross the road?" I muttered, not helping. Just then a siren blared in the distance. The men exchanged glances. "Rangers," one of them spat. "We'll deal with you later." They jumped back into the truck and sped off. "Saved by the bell," I sighed. A park ranger vehicle pulled up moments later. An older man with a stern face stepped out. "You folks okay?" he asked. "Never better," I replied. "Just out for a casual jog, being chased by lunatics." He raised an eyebrow. "You want to explain that?" We quickly recounted the events. The ranger's expression grew more serious. "We've had reports of missing campers in the area," he said. "Didn't think it was more than people getting lost." "Well, now you know," Karen said. "He radioed for backup and instructed us to stay with him." Within half an hour, more rangers arrived, along with local law enforcement. They organised a search party and escorted us back to the main campground. As we passed by Bill's campsite, it was completely cleared out, no sign he'd ever been there. "Looks like your friend packed up," the ranger noted. "Some friend," I muttered. Over the next few hours, we gave detailed statements. They asked if we could identify the men we saw. "One of them is named Bill," I said. "Tall, bearded, looks like he wrestles bears for fun." "Could be anyone up here," the officer replied. As the sun began to set, the authorities advised us to leave the park for our safety. "Don't have to tell me twice," I said. Karen and I exchanged contact information. "Maybe next time we'll choose a beach vacation," she suggested. "Sand castles over serial killers any day," I agreed. As I drove out of the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. But at least for now, I was getting the hell out of Dodge. A few days later, I did some digging online. Turns out there had been rumours about a group of poachers operating in the area, using the park's remoteness to their advantage. They weren't just hunting animals, they were trafficking illegal goods. And apparently, they didn't like witnesses. The leader was a man named William Bill Harkins, a notorious figure with a history of violent crimes. He'd managed to evade capture for years, blending in with the very campers and hikers he preyed upon. Authorities issued a warrant for his arrest, but as far as I know, he's still out there somewhere, moving from one remote location to another. I guess the mountains aren't as peaceful as I thought. My name is Kevin Scott, and back in 1999, I was working search and rescue up in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I spent most of my time navigating dense, misty forests and scrambling up rocky hillsides, helping lost hikers who'd wandered too far from the trails or wrangling bears that got a little too comfortable with human food. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, that's why I got into the job in the first place. Nothing appealed to me more than a life free from office politics and fluorescent lights. Out here, it was just me, the wild, and whoever I happened to be saving. That summer, we'd had more than the usual number of missing persons cases, particularly in an area known as Deep Gully. The locals stayed away from that part of the park, claiming it was cursed or some such nonsense. Old-timers had plenty of stories about hikers who'd gone in there never to come back, or who'd stumbled out looking like they'd seen the devil himself. But it wasn't the supernatural nonsense that had me on edge. It was the sheer number of disappearances piling up. I was sent out to Deep Gully to investigate another missing person report. A family of 4 had been camping near the base, and the father, a man named Daniel Whitmore, had gone for a late-night walk and hadn't come back. His wife, visibly shaken, had flagged down a ranger the next morning, her hands trembling and her voice barely above a whisper as she explained how her husband had just vanished into the trees. They had 2 kids with them, about 8 and 12, both sitting wide-eyed and silent as their mother relayed the details. Now, usually when a guy goes missing on a walk, you can chalk it up to getting lost or even falling asleep somewhere. But something about the way she described it, the quickness of his disappearance, the total silence that followed, gave me chills. I brushed it off, though. I'd been out there enough times to know how the wilderness could warp reality, especially for people not used to its isolation. I took off around midday with my pack, water, radio, and a machete. We weren't exactly encouraged to carry firearms unless there was an immediate known danger, and I wasn't about to argue with policy over a routine search. The plan was simple: follow the trail where Daniel had gone, sweep the area, and report back. Deep Gully lived up to its name. It was dark even in broad daylight, with thick canopy cover and massive trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The place felt ancient, like it had been hiding secrets long before humans ever stumbled into it. Birds rarely sang in that part of the forest. Instead, there was an oppressive quiet, broken only by the crunch of my boots against the earth. I had a solid 2 hours of nothing, not even a hint of disturbed foliage or broken branches that would signal where Daniel had gone. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't long before I started seeing strange markings on the trees, deep, claw-like gouges running down the bark in patterns that didn't quite look natural. Bears, maybe, but they didn't usually roam this far from the streams, and they wouldn't have left marks this precise. About 3 hours in, I stumbled across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A scattering of bones, picked clean. They lay in a crude circle, almost ritualistic, arranged with a strange precision that didn't feel random. I knelt to get a better look, noticing that the bones weren't animal. They were too big for that. My gut twisted as I realized they were human, maybe a femur, a couple of ribs, and what looked like part of a jaw. I wasn't an expert, but I'd seen enough to know the difference. Suddenly, the radio crackled, breaking the silence so loudly I almost dropped it. A voice came through, staticky but clear enough. "Kevin, any sign of him yet?" I pressed the button. Found something. Not him, but human remains, scattered. There was a long pause before the voice responded. "Stay put, Kevin. We're sending backup." But I didn't stay put. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved a little further into the thicket, feeling the eerie quiet sink deeper into my bones. The claw marks on the trees became more frequent, almost overlapping in places, and a foul stench filled the air, a mix of rotting meat and something sharper like sulphur. It was thick enough to make my eyes water. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the thick branches above. But then it moved. The creature was hunched low to the ground, with legs that looked almost canine but were stretched and knotted like the limbs of an emaciated deer. Its skin was taut and greyish, stretched over a skeletal frame that seemed both human and something much, much older. The head was the worst, elongated, almost horse-like, but with too many teeth, visible even when its mouth was closed. It reminded me of some nightmarish cross between a wolf and a man, though it was neither. I froze, barely breathing, watching as it sniffed the air, tilting its head in a way that felt too deliberate, too calculating. I had no idea if it had spotted me, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. Slowly I began to back away, step by step, each move deliberate and soundless. Just as I thought I'd made it far enough, I heard a sharp crack, my boot landing on a dried branch. In a flash, it turned its head, snapping toward me with unnatural speed. I could see its claws digging into the ground, coiling its body like a spring, ready to lunge. My brain screamed to run, but my body was locked in place, caught in the terror of that split-second decision. Then it lunged. I managed to snap out of it just in time, diving behind a fallen tree as the creature crashed into the spot where I'd been standing. I heard it thrashing, claws scraping against wood as it clawed at the tree trunk between us. I knew I couldn't outrun it, and I wasn't about to wrestle it with my bare hands. There was nothing left to do but fight. I grabbed the machete from my belt, hands shaking but holding steady enough. As it tried to scramble over the log, I swung upwards, slicing across what looked like its shoulder. It let out a choked, rattling sound, staggering back just a bit, but that only seemed to make it angrier. It reared up, towering over me as I crouched defensively, trying to predict its next move. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of something, a branding mark on its neck, burned into its flesh, some twisted spiral symbol. I didn't recognize it, but it was as if someone, somewhere, had claimed it, like livestock. Though who would want to keep something like this around was beyond me. The creature lashed out again, and I barely dodged, feeling its claws graze my arm, leaving a burning sensation in their wake. The pain jolted me into action, and I swung the machete with everything I had, this time catching it under the jaw. The blade dug deep, and for a moment I thought it was done. But the thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it grabbed the machete, yanking it out of my hands with one powerful swipe, flinging it to the side. Unarmed and backed into a corner, I did the only thing I could think of. I scrambled backward, looking for anything I could use. But the forest offered nothing. Just as it leapt toward me, something unexpected happened. A shot rang out from somewhere behind us, and the creature faltered, a spurt of dark, tar-like blood oozing from its shoulder. My radio crackled again, and I heard my partner's voice shouting, "Kevin, run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, zigzagging through the trees, barely aware of the sounds of pursuit behind me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, adrenaline dulling the pain. Finally, I broke through the dense forest, stumbling back onto the trail where a team of rangers was waiting, guns drawn. The creature didn't follow me out. It stopped just within the tree line, its eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intelligence, as if it understood exactly what it had lost. Then it turned and slinked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. Back at the station, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, but no one could offer any answers. I told my boss about the branding mark, the bones, the strange silence in the gully, but all I got were blank stares and nervous glances. Officially, the incident was chalked up to a bear attack, an excuse we all knew didn't hold up, but kept people from asking too many questions. Months later, I heard rumours of a cult operating in the area, one that supposedly worshipped ancient forest spirits or some nonsense like that. The symbol I'd seen on the creature matched a crude drawing in a confiscated notebook found near another ranger station.